Welcome to MD Talk Studios, where science, health, fitness, and technology come together through powerful storytelling. Here we break down the breakthroughs shaping our world, from medical discoveries to human performance, from cutting-edge research to everyday wellness, all told in a way that's clear, meaningful, and built for your life. This is your moment to learn, explore, and stay ahead. Welcome to another original episode from MD Talk.
What happens when we push the limits of what is possible, challenging the very definition of life itself? Imagine, a world where death isn't the final chapter, where science grapples directly with questions that have haunted humanity for, forever.
Right.
That's where we're heading today, diving into a strange, fascinating, and frankly kind of unsettling corner of the mid-20th century. It was a time of rapid change, wasn't it? And ambitious, sometimes terrifying scientific pursuits.
Yeah, definitely. And specifically, we're going to unpack a stack of sources we've gathered. It's quite a mix, everything from like a Reddit thread and a PubMed article on a specific device to Wikipedia entries, some pieces on Soviet science and fiction, even an Atlas Obscura article. Okay. And the goal is to really understand a truly remarkable piece of history. The 1940 Soviet film Experiments in the Revival of Organisms.
Right, that film.
And our mission really is to go beyond just, looking at a bizarre old film. Sure. We want to understand what it actually depicted, the science or claimed science behind it, the unique historical context it emerged from.
Which sounds crucial.
Absolutely. And the really profound ethical questions it raised back then, and honestly still makes us grapple with today.
Yeah, I bet.
So, settle in as we explore this strange and I think pretty significant deep dive together.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The film itself experiments in the revival of organisms. It presents some pretty striking and I have to say unsettling visuals right from the start. That's what the sources say, right?
Oh, yeah.
The core image that immediately grabs you, the one people always talk about, it's a close-up of a severed dog's head.
That's the one. It's incredibly potent imagery. The film apparently opens by showing this isolated canine head just there, seemingly disconnected from anybody.
Wow.
And it's being methodically connected to this complex-looking machine via a whole network of tubes and wires.
Okay.
And the sources describe this intricate apparatus as the autojector.
The autojector, got it.
Then the film tries to visually demonstrate that this head is somehow being kept alive. It shows the head supposedly reacting to different things, maybe a bright light or a loud sound nearby.
Reacting? How?
Well, the claim being made is that these aren't just random post-mortem twitches, They're presented as deliberate, or at least reflexive, responses. It's meant to show the head is being sustained, maybe even experiencing some kind of awareness, purely through this artificial circulation system.
That image alone is just incredibly powerful and disturbing, even thinking about it now, decades later.
It really is.
But the film, as described in our sources, it doesn't just stop there with the isolated head.
No, it goes further. It spends time showcasing the autojector machine itself. The source mentioned it gives a visual explanation of its components, detailing parts like linear diaphragm pumps.
Okay, so the technical bits.
Yeah, which would have been used to circulate the fluids, obviously. And a water reservoir, described as being crucial for oxygen exchange within the system, like an artificial lung. It paints a picture of this seemingly sophisticated piece of technology, sophisticated for the 1940s, certainly designed with the explicit purpose of sustaining life functions outside of a complete intact organism.
Okay, so they're setting the stage, showing the tech.
Exactly. And then the film really escalates the drama. It presents an even more ambitious, more dramatic experiment. It shows the process of inducing what it calls clinical death in a whole dog.
A whole dog, okay.
Yeah. The process, as relayed by the sources and apparently shown in the film, involved deliberately draining the animal's blood.
Oh, man.
The film uses these stark, almost clinical animated diagrams to illustrate what's happening internally, showing the lungs stopping, the heart stopping.
Like a medical animation?
Kind of, yeah. Then, according to the film's narrative, the dog is left in this state, clinical death, for about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
And then the autojector is brought into play.
So the idea is to reverse death in the whole animal, not just keep a part alive.
That is the extraordinary central claim of this part of the film, yes. The autojector is then used to gradually return the blood to the dog's body, circulating it artificially.
And the film shows?
It shows the dramatic return to life or, the contempt It depicts the heart starting to beat again, maybe irregularly at first, fibrillation they call it.
Right.
Before supposedly settling into a normal strong rhythm. Then respiration is shown, resuming.
And the machine comes off.
Finally, the autojector machine is disconnected. The implication is the animal's own systems have taken over again. And here's where the film makes its most astonishing and honestly pretty unbelievable claims, as sources like Atlas Obscura and Scira damn interesting point out.
What claims?
It states, often through text on screen or narration, that these dogs didn't just survive for a few moments or hours, but that they recovered fully, lived for years afterward, grew, gained weight, even went on to have families, puppies.
Lived for years and had families. That sounds almost miraculous, like a total triumph over death.
That's exactly how the film presents it. A triumph.
But then, digging deeper into some of the other sources we've got, there's a pretty significant note of caution, right? Or maybe outright skepticism.
Definitely.
Like the Wikipedia entry on Sergei Bryukhonenko, he's the scientist behind this.
The main scientist, yeah.
It suggests the film might actually be a restaging, done for the camera, not exactly a live, raw documentary.
That's a key point raised, yes.
Yeah.
A restaging for cinematic effect.
And the reason they suspect this is kind of telling, isn't it? It says something like, none of the more scientifically questionable experiments are shown in full-frame shots.
Exactly. Which implies maybe deliberate framing choices were made, perhaps to hide certain details or, manage the viewer's perception during the most critical, maybe most dubious moments.
So controlling what we see.
That observation is absolutely critical for interpreting the film. It really forces us to question what we're watching. Is it a straightforward scientific record? Is it a dramatization? Or, as we'll get into, maybe even propaganda?
Right.
And furthermore, both that same Wikipedia source and the damn interesting article bring forward a really significant discrepancy, a gap between the triumphant story told in the film and the documented outcomes found in the actual laboratory records from the time.
The lab records, what do they say?
Well, they paint a much less successful and, frankly, much grimmer picture. The records indicate that the dogs, especially the ones put through the full clinical Deccan revival, they only survived for a matter of days, not years.
Days, not years.
Days. And crucially, they suffered serious, irreversible brain damage.
Wow, okay. That's a massive difference. So the film's depiction of these happy, healthy, long-living dogs, it might be just a narrative facade, hiding a much harsher reality.
It certainly looks that way based on those sources, yeah. A carefully constructed narrative potentially masking the much less successful, much more tragic lab result.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? What does that huge gap between the film and the records tell us about the film's purpose or the mindset of the people who made it back then? What did they want people to believe versus what the actual data showed?
It tells us a great deal about motivations and context, which is exactly why we need to understand the man and the machine at the center of it all.
Absolutely. Let's dive into that. Section 2, the scientist and the machine. Who was this Sergei Bryukhonenko?
Okay, Sergei Bryukhonenko. He was a medical researcher, an inventor, a surgeon, born in 1890. The PubMed Central article we looked at mentions he was associated with the Chemical Pharmaceutical Institute early in his career.
Okay.
And his most famous invention, in this context anyway, was the autojector, the machine we talked about.
Right.
He first publicly demonstrated a version of this machine way back in September 1925.
25, wow, that's earlier than the film.
Much earlier. He presented it to the scientific community at the Second Congress of Russian Pathologists in Moscow.
September 1925, that's really specific. And his early machine, was it like simpler than the one in the 1940 film?
It sounds like it, yeah. The PubMed source describes that initial 1925 setup. It used a relatively simple configuration, 2 electric pumps.
Okay.
These pumps supplied a severed dog head with citrated blood that's blood treated so it won't clot.
Right, anticoagulated.
Exactly. Circulating it through rubber tubes. The blood coming out of the head then went to a special vessel where it was oxygenated, basically acting as an artificial lung.
Makes sense.
And this oxygenated blood was also warmed up, to body temperature around 37 to 40 degrees Celsius before being pumped back into the head.
So mimicking the body's functions. And what were the results they reported from that very first public demonstration back in 25?
Well, the demonstration reportedly succeeded in keeping the severed dog head alive, in the sense of maintaining some physiological function and responsiveness for about an hour and 40 minutes.
An hour 40, wow.
During this time, the head was said to have shown various reflexes, proving that circulation and some level of neural activity were being artificially sustained.
Okay.
But here's a fascinating detail from that PubMed article. Despite how revolutionary and, frankly, bizarre the experiment was,
Yeah.
this initial public demonstration in 1925 was barely noticed by the wider scientific community at the time. And remarkably, it was completely ignored by the public.
Really? Ignored, keeping a severed head alive. You'd think that would cause a massive sensation.
You would, but apparently not back then. It didn't make the splash one might expect.
That is surprising. So the initial breakthrough just sort of fizzled. How did it get from that, being largely ignored in 1925, to being the subject of a state-sponsored film by 1940? What changed?
Well, Bryukhonenko didn't give up. He kept working on it. He continued his research, perfecting his technique over the following years.
Refining things.
Exactly. Refining the autojector machine itself, probably making it more efficient, more reliable, but also improving the surgical techniques needed to, keep the organ viable during the process, and making advancements in how they stabilized and oxygenated the blood.
Okay, so technical improvements across the board.
Right. And as the technique got better and the machine more capable, it opened up all these new possibilities for research. Things that went beyond just showing, hey, look, we can keep this thing alive artificially.
And this is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because those new possibilities shifted the focus.
Precisely.
The sources mention that these improvements allowed Bryukhonenko and his team to start investigating the brain's reactions to different substances, like introducing drugs into the blood, being pumped through the isolated brain and seeing what happened. Studying its physiology in isolation.
Yeah, a sort of disembodied pharmacology.
And even more significantly, they could study the precise effects of death and revival on the brain itself. What actually happens neurologically during dying, and maybe more importantly, during the process of being brought back.
That was a huge potential area of study.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about the spectacle anymore. It was about understanding the fundamental processes of life and death at a much deeper neurological level.
Right.
And this potential for deeper physiological understanding. That's what really started to excite the broader scientific community. It wasn't just the, macabre aspect of a living head.
No.
It was the dawning realization that the principle behind the autojector, this idea of an external machine taking over heart and lung function, could have incredibly practical, life-saving applications.
So the medical potential.
Exactly. Scientists got really excited about using the autojector to temporarily replace the heart's function. Imagine the possibilities. Performing complicated surgery on a heart that was actually stopped.
Which would have been impossible before, right?
Yeah.
Deadly.
Absolutely deadly. This was a massive potential breakthrough for surgery. That captured the scientific imagination far more than just the severed head, I think.
And this idea, this autojector, it connects directly to technology we still use in hospitals every single day, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The significance of Bryukhonenko's work is really hammered home by the title of that PubMed article we keep mentioning. It calls his autojector the first apparatus for cardiopulmonary bypass and extracorporeal life support.
Cardiopulmonary bypass, like heart-lung machines in surgery.
Exactly. This is the direct ancestor of the heart-lung bypass machine used during open heart surgery. And also things like ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which supports patients with severe heart or lung failure.
Wow.
The damn interesting article also explicitly says Bryukhonenko's autojector paved the way for our modern artificial life support machines. And the PubMed source confirms its foundational importance for modern heart operations.
So what started as these incredibly dramatic, visually disturbing experiments, isolated heads, trying to revive animals from death, that actually laid the conceptual and practical groundwork for technology that's now completely standard in hospitals worldwide, enabling things like open heart surgery, keeping critically ill people alive. That's a truly remarkable and maybe unexpected legacy from such unsettling origins.
It really is. But to truly appreciate the full picture of these experiments, the scientific audacity, the ethical complexities, the sheer weirdness of it all, we really need to place them in their specific context. Early Soviet Russia. That backdrop is crucial.
Okay, let's move to section 3 then, the context. What was going on in early Soviet Russia that would foster this kind of ambitious and, as we've seen, sometimes ethically challenging research?
Well, early Soviet Russia, especially in the years after the revolution and the Civil War, was a time of intense scientific exploration and, ambition. The sources paint a picture of a society deeply marked by the very recent past. One source, that PubMed Central article again, starkly calls it the 1914-1923 Reign of Death.
The Reign of Death.
Yeah, a decade covering World War I, the Revolution, the brutal Civil War. This period left Russia with profound anxieties about death, loss, survival, the fragility of life itself.
Understandable.
So science in this environment wasn't just an academic thing. It was seen as this powerful tool capable of tackling fundamental challenges and maybe even the physiological processes of death and revival. There was this palpable sense of urgency, a belief that science could conquer nature, perhaps even conquer death.
So it wasn't just curiosity driving it. There was this practical, maybe even existential dimension tied to all that collective trauma.
Exactly. The PubMed Central article highlights that while the research definitely dug into fundamental physiological questions, there was a very clear eye on applying this knowledge, applying it to medical practice, especially surgery. In a nation rebuilding after just immense loss, the idea of being able to intervene in deaths, to potentially bring people back, or to perform life-saving surgeries that were impossible before, that resonated really deeply. It was about restoring life and capability in a society that had seen so much death and disruption.
And these ideas exploring life, death, artificial bodies, they weren't just stuck in the labs, were they? They were apparently swirling around in the culture too, showing up in fiction. The sources point out a really fascinating, almost uncanny parallel.
Yes, this is a truly striking part of the story. It suggests these concepts were genuinely floating in the air, as the PubMed Central article puts it. The source points out that Alexander Belyaev, who was a debutante writer then, he published a science fiction story called The Head of Professor Dowell in 1925.
1925 again.
And what's remarkable is the timing. So this story came out just months before Bryukhonenko gave his first public demonstration of the severed dog head experiment.
The Head of Professor Dowell, and the premise of that story was...
The premise, described in the PubMed Central article, is startlingly similar to Bryukhonenko's actual experiment. It depicts a severed human head, the head of a brilliant scientist, no less being kept alive and conscious by machinery in a laboratory.
A severed human head kept alive by machines in a lab, published just before the real public demo of a severed dog head kept alive by machines. That parallel is almost too perfect. It really suggests these ideas were just bubbling up everywhere, maybe from the anxieties of the time, the new technological possibilities in science and fiction at the same time.
It really does seem that way. And adding another layer, Belyaev himself later claimed the story was strongly autobiographical.
Autobiographical? How?
Well, he had suffered from a severe disease, tuberculosis of the spine, I think, which resulted in him being confined to a plaster bed for 3.5 years. He experienced lower body paralysis. He described this period as feeling like a head without a body.
Wow, that makes it even more poignant.
Yeah, and he said that directly informed his fictional exploration of that very premise.
So it wasn't just some macabre fantasy for him, it came from a very real, deeply isolating physical experience. But while the science and the fiction shared this core unsettling idea, their ultimate goals and how people reacted to them were quite different, according to the sources.
They were, significantly so.
Yeah.
Bryukhonenko's work, despite the drama, was fundamentally driven by scientific inquiry, aiming for medical application, particularly surgery.
Right.
Belyaev, on the other hand, used the living head premise to explore much broader themes. He was considering death and revival not just physiologically, but as parts of human existence. He used the story to examine science's role in modifying death, and crucially, to question the value and the ethical implications of doing that. He was embedding these really anguished ethical questions in his narratives.
So one focused on the how, the other on the why, and should we? How did the Soviet state and the public react to these two different approaches? To Bryukhonenko's real experiments versus Belyaev's fictional exploration.
The PubMed Central article notes a really interesting divergence. State agencies saw the potential in Bryukhonenko's work, medical potential, maybe propaganda potential too, and they provided generous support for his experiments.
Okay, state backing.
But the Soviet public, this might seem surprising to us now. Instead of being horrified by reports and pictures of severed heads being kept alive, they were reportedly fascinated. Images of these experiments appeared in popular newspapers and magazines. It generated public curiosity, not widespread ethical alarm.
Fascination, not alarm. Interesting.
And in striking contrast, Belyaev's explicit ethical concerns, the core of his story, they seem to have been lost on its Russian audiences, according to the source. The public seemed much more captivated by the scientific spectacle than by the philosophical questions it raised.
So the sheer possibility, the scientific wow factor, maybe overshadowed the ethical discomfort for many people back then. Which leads us right to another point raised in the sources. The potential propaganda angle around the 1940 film itself.
Yes, that definitely comes up. The Alice Obscura article explicitly mentions the suggestion that the film might have been more than just a scientific demonstration. It raises the possibility that it was a hoax, an elaborate scheme to intimidate American scientists.
Intimidate American scientists? Why would they want to do that, especially in 1940?
Well, presumably it would be part of an effort to project this image of formidable Soviet scientific prowess onto the world stage. Geopolitical tensions were rising, World War II was looming.
Right.
By showing researchers who seemed to be pushing the very boundaries of life and death, maybe in ways other nations weren't, the Soviet Union could aim to demonstrate its technological superiority. It could gain a psychological edge or just garner international respect.
Yeah.
Or maybe fear.
Okay, projecting strength through science. But then, one of the Reddit comments we looked at offers a totally conflicting view, doesn't it? Suggesting it might have been US or UK propaganda claiming this was what Russia was doing.
That's the counter-narrative presented in that comment, yeah. It highlights how sensational, unsettling images, like the ones in the film, could be sort of weaponized by different sides during periods of conflict, like the Cold War later on. The goal of Western propaganda like that might have been to paint the Soviets as engaging in inhumane, Frankenstein-like science, using the disturbing visuals to create a negative image of the regime.
Two sides of the propaganda coin, potentially. And if we think about Soviet film propaganda more broadly, according to that Cosmonaut article, it shifted by the 1940s, didn't it?
It did.
Earlier stuff focused on collective effort, international socialism. But by the 40s, especially with the war approaching, the focus moved more towards celebrating individual heroes, promoting nationalism, defending the motherland. How might a film like Experiments in the Revival of Organisms, focusing on a specific scientist and machine, achieving this dramatic triumph?
Yeah.
How might that fit or not fit that evolving trend?
It's a complex fit, I think. On one hand, showcasing a brilliant Soviet scientist like Bryukhonenko and his seemingly miraculous invention, that aligns somewhat with the shift towards highlighting individual heroes contributing to the state's strength and prestige.
Right.
The triumph over death could be framed as a national achievement, showing off Soviet science. But on the other hand, the subject matter isn't explicitly about, say, military defense or overt nationalism like many 1940s films were. It's maybe more subtly aligned, like an underlying message that Soviet science was conquering nature itself, pushing boundaries, which could definitely be interpreted as projecting national strength and eventually for the future, just through science rather than tanks or planes.
It's undeniably clear that these experiments weren't just happening in a vacuum. They were deeply tangled up with the cultural anxieties, the political ambitions, the propaganda strategies of the time. And that complex web leads us straight into Section 4, the ethical abyss. Because while the history and science are fascinating, the imagery and the methods, they are undeniably disturbing to us now, and they raise these huge, enduring ethical questions.
Absolutely. And the sources explicitly address the ethical reactions these experiments provoked, not just with hindsight, but even among Bryukhonenko's contemporaries. That PubMed Central article, for example, mentions a letter from Ivanov Razumnik. He was a prominent Russian writer and critic at the time.
Okay.
And he described the reports of Bryukhonenko's experiments, especially the severed head stuff, as terrifying.
Terrifying. What specifically worried him so much?
His core concerns, as detailed in the source, were about the very limits of scientific experimentation. He was asking, who gets to set those limits? What's acceptable practice when you're pursuing knowledge? What lines should simply not be crossed? He articulated this profound fear of what he called the first step.
The first step down a dangerous path.
Exactly. A slippery slope of ethical compromise. His fear was, you start with experiments on dog heads. What's the next logical and terrifying step? Separating the head of a human being, maybe a prisoner on death row.
Oh, wow.
And from there, he envisioned it progressing to transplanting heads between bodies, culminating in these increasingly bizarre and ethically monstrous scenarios. He used the dramatic image of Beethoven's head attached to the body of a snake.
That's quite an image. Very effective in conveying that fear of unchecked science.
It really underscores his deep anxiety about where this could lead if it wasn't grounded by strong ethical principles.
What did he think about the scientists themselves or the government's role in guiding or regulating this?
Well, he spoke of what he saw as the moral deafness of the scientists involved, implying they were so focused on the technical challenge, the scientific outcome, that they seemed unwilling or unable to really consider the profound ethical implications.
Right. Tunnel vision, maybe?
Perhaps. And he was equally critical of the Bolshevik government, which he viewed as utterly immoral itself, and therefore incapable of providing the necessary ethical guidance or setting moral boundaries for science. He saw this dangerous mix: scientists pushing boundaries without enough introspection, and a government unable or unwilling to provide an ethical framework.
So basically an ethical vacuum where responsibility should have been.
Essentially, yeah. Although it's interesting, he did present a kind of utilitarian argument, but with a very specific, crucial caveat.
Okay.
He conceded that saving human lives might potentially justify certain experiments.
Yeah.
But he drew a clear, non-negotiable line. He referenced that controversial phrase, "the goal justifies the means," but immediately added, "is an awful formula, but only if the means are other human beings." So for him, experimenting on animals, well, maybe troubling, was fundamentally different. It was potentially justifiable if the ultimate goal was saving human lives. Using other humans as subjects, though, that was an absolute moral violation for him.
That's a really important distinction he made. Now, fast forward several decades to the discussions we see in the modern sources, like that Reddit thread or the damn interesting comments. You see a lot of the same gut reactions, don't you? Though maybe filtered differently.
Oh, absolutely. You see strong, immediate emotional responses. Horror, sadness, real disgust aimed at the scientists, especially about the apparent suffering of the dog in the film. Those feelings about the animal's treatment are really prominent in the online comments.
Yeah. But right alongside that, you get the counter-arguments, echoing, maybe unknowingly, some of Ivanov or Zimnik's points about potential benefits. The sources note people arguing that this work, however disturbing it looks now, ultimately helped pave the way for huge advances in modern medicine. Things like life support, organ transplants, even stuff related to prosthetics. They're cited as areas that benefited from this early foundational research into circulation and keeping organs going.
Right. You see comments framing the animals, especially the dogs, as sort of martyrs for science.
Martyrs for science.
Yeah, arguing that some sacrifices are necessary for the name of science in medicine. It's that utilitarian perspective, put very starkly. The difficult argument that the potential benefit to humans, now and in the future, outweighs the suffering of the animal subjects.
And the discussion in the sources really broadens out from there, doesn't it? Bringing in comparisons between these Soviet experiments and other really controversial historical cases of animal and horrifyingly human experimentation.
Yeah, that's where the conversation in the comment sections gets particularly difficult and, frankly, dark. But it is present in the sources we look at. Mentions are made of Unit 731.
Oh, yeah. The Japanese unit in WWII.
Right. Infamous for performing horrific experiments on Chinese prisoners' vivisection, exposure to diseases, poisons, extreme cold, treating them callously as logs.
Sickening.
And the comments also bring up the controversial fact that some Unit 731 researchers were reportedly given immunity by the U.S. after the war in exchange for their data, which sparks this intense debate. Was that data even scientifically valuable, or was it, as some sources claim, sloppy and flawed because the experiments were so uncontrolled and basically just torture?
A deeply uncomfortable question. And the sources also mention Nazi research, obviously.
Another clear example of monstrous human experimentation.
And sadly, examples from U.S. history, too. Experiments on vulnerable populations.
Yeah, the comments mentioned documented cases of experiments on black people, sometimes without anesthesia, based on racist pseudoscience.
Unbelievable.
As well as experiments on asylum patients, prisoners, even newborns, where pain management often wasn't considered necessary or provided until relatively recently in U.S. medical history.
So these comparisons in the source material, they're highlighting that ethically awful research hasn't been confined to just one country or system, unfortunately.
Exactly. While the scale and systematic horror of places like Unit 731 or the Nazi camps are unique in their evil, the history of science in many nations includes these dark chapters where ethics were disregarded, often targeting marginalized groups.
And the sources specifically bring up Robert J. White's experiments in the U.S. much later in the 60s and 70s, the two-brain dogs and the monkey head transplant.
Yes, both damn interesting and Reddit sources discuss White's work. It's presented as another example in the sort of controversial lineage of pushing biological boundaries. The monkey head transplant experiment is noted for its outcome. The monkey was apparently paralyzed below the neck, but kept control of its head and senses. According to accounts, it even tried to bite one of the scientists. But while ethically super questionable, White's work is presented in the damn interesting source as having helped us better understand the body's physiological ability to adapt to radical interventions and as contributing knowledge relevant to organ transplants.
So these later examples, also hugely controversial, are cited in the sources as cases where pushing boundaries, often at great cost to the animals, did lead to some physiological understanding or advancements applied later in human medicine. This whole debate in the sources goes even deeper, doesn't it? Into philosophy, really. About life itself.
It certainly does. The comments sections, especially on Damn Interesting, get right into fundamental questions about animal sentience, pain, consciousness. You see all sorts of viewpoints.
Like what?
Some argue animals clearly have feelings, awareness. Others claim they don't feel pain like humans do. Some say it's just arrogance to draw a strict line. A recurring idea, sometimes linked to philosophers like Bentham, is that the key ethical question is simply, can they suffer? If yes, then their suffering matters morally.
There's even an argument mentioned that cruelty doesn't apply to animals because the animal kingdom is just harsh. It's not cruel in the human sense.
That viewpoint comes up in the commentary, yeah. As a way to potentially dismiss or lessen the ethical weight. And then there's the challenging point raised that, okay, we have modern ethical boundaries, now we don't clone humans, for instance. But maybe there are still worse things that are done to animals in present experiments than what we see in the 1940 film.
That's a tough claim, suggesting current practices might be just as bad or worse by some measures.
It's difficult to grapple with. It depends entirely on your criteria, of course.
And maybe the most provocative argument mentioned in the comments, the idea that sometimes blurring ethical boundaries is actually how breakthroughs happen.
That argument is indeed made within the commentary, and the comment goes so far as to controversially and abhorrently cite Joseph Mengele.
Mengele, oh no.
Claiming that while his actions during the Holocaust were monstrous beyond words, some physiological understanding was theoretically gained from his brutal, non-consensual research. Though, obviously, such findings are never credited and are forever tainted. It's crucial to stress, and the source presents it this way, as a comment within a discussion, that this is an argument made within the source material. It's illustrating an extreme perspective. In the ends, justify the means debate.
Right. We are absolutely not endorsing that viewpoint or Mengel's actions. We're reporting that this extreme perspective appeared in the commentary sparked by the film.
Exactly. It just serves to show the depth and the darkness of the ethical questions this film can still provoke, even decades later.
That comparison, however vile, really throws the ethical challenge into sharp relief. It forces us, exploring these sources, to ask, why aren't these specific experiments recreated today? The Atlas Obscura and Damn Interesting articles are pretty clear, aren't they?
Yeah, they state it's because the blatant animal abuse and disregard for modern standards of medical ethics would turn stomachs.
Right. Modern ethical review boards, animal care committees, stricter welfare standards. They just wouldn't allow keeping a severed head alive like that, or reviving animals knowing they'd have severe brain damage, just for basic research today.
The bar for justifying animal use is much, much higher now. You need clear potential benefits and a strict requirement to minimize suffering.
The ethical landscape is so different. It's compared in the sources, in a way, to those famous but ethically problematic psychology experiments from the past. Milgram's obedience studies, the Stanford prison experiment.
Right. Those are considered ethically unacceptable to replicate today because of the distress they cause the human participants.
But they relied on methods that, while controversial, really shaped our understanding of human behavior and led directly to developing much stricter ethical guidelines for research with people.
Exactly. They were seminal studies, gave important insights, but used methods that violate today's standards. These historical examples, both physiological and psychological, force us to confront that difficult question from the sources. Is scientific progress always ethical? Does the potential benefit to humanity justify any suffering, animal suffering, or, in darker times, human suffering?
It's a question with no easy answer, and it just keeps coming back as technology advances, pushing boundaries again and again. But okay, beyond the huge ethical debate and the undeniable, if controversial, scientific legacy, this film and these experiments have had another life, haven't they? An unexpected cultural afterlife.
Yeah, moving to Section 5, Echoes and Legacy. The immediate most significant legacy, as we discussed, is the medical one. Bryukhonenko's autojector was a crucial step towards modern life support, bypass machines, understanding organ transplants. That tech thread is pretty direct.
Right, the practical medical side. But the 1940 film itself has lived on in totally different ways. It's proved to be this surprisingly potent, enduring image that's influenced artists, creators in various fields, sometimes in really unexpected places.
Yes, the Wikipedia source gives some great examples of this cultural afterlife, like the acclaimed Polish poet Wesoła Szymborska, a Nobel laureate.
Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah. She apparently discussed watching the film and the profound impact it had on her. She even dedicated a poem, just called Experiment, to her reflections on the disturbing imagery and implications.
Wow. A Nobel Prize winning poet grappling with this obscure Soviet film that really speaks to the power of its core imagery.
And maybe even more surprising for some listeners, the heavy metal band Metallica.
Metallica, really?
Yeah, they incorporated elements of the film into the music video for their song All Nightmare Long. The video is partly based on the film, apparently showing scenes of Soviet scientists reanimating a dead cat, directly referencing the kinds of experiments in the Revival of Organisms.
Okay, from Nobel literature to heavy metal. That shows an incredibly broad, unexpected reach for this film's influence. That's wild.
Another example from Wikipedia comes from the musician Neil Cicerega, maybe better known as Lemon Demon online. His 2016 album Spirit Phone, which has a bit of a cult following, has a track that was originally titled Experiments in the Revival, a direct reference to the film. Again, showing how this old historical document has filtered into contemporary culture, internet spaces.
So the film's central idea hasn't just stayed in academic circles. It's seeped into modern music, art, online culture, and the Reddit and Damn Interesting Comments list tons of other fictional works too, right? Films, books, TV shows with similar concepts.
Oh yeah, loads of them. Things like classic horror like Reanimator, B-movies like The Thing with Two Heads, a book called Elephants on Acid, currently touches on it, a story from Roald Dahl's Tale of the Unexpected, even references to C.S. Lewis.
So all these examples show how deeply that core idea, manipulating life and death artificially, technology, creating unsettling biological states, just captured the public imagination, fueled both fascination and unease for decades.
Definitely.
Why do you think this particular film, these specific experiments, despite being old, maybe scientifically shaky, why do they still resonate so much and influence culture today?
Well, I think it's because they touch so directly, so viscerally on these fundamental questions humanity's always grappled with. What is life? What's death? What happens to consciousness when the body fails? Is there a soul? Where is it?
The big questions.
Exactly. The imagery of an isolated, maybe conscious head or an organism brought back from death. It's profoundly unsettling precisely because it forces us to confront these deep mysteries in this very literal technological way. It challenges our most basic understanding of what it means to be alive.
And as you mentioned earlier, it represents this specific historical moment where scientific ambition seemed almost limitless, or at least operating with fewer of the ethical breaks we try to apply today. That glimpse into a past era of science, before certain lines were clearly drawn, is both fascinating and kind of cautionary.
It really is. It highlights the unsettling potential of technology when it's applied to the most basic, maybe sacred, or just unknown elements of biology, life, death, consciousness. It's a stark reminder of the power inherent in scientific progress and the potential danger when that power maybe outruns our ethical wisdom or understanding.
It's a film that, maybe wasn't a perfect scientific documentary, but it's undeniably this powerful historical document. It reflects the science being explored then, the deep societal anxieties after war and revolution, the complex dance between science fiction and propaganda, and amazingly, it still sparks these profound ethical debates and influences culture all these decades later.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've journeyed through the unsettling visuals of this bizarre 1940 Soviet film, traced modern medical tech back to its concepts, looked at the unique cultural and political landscape that fostered it, dug into the timeless ethical debates about progress and life's value, and seen its strange echoes in modern culture.
It's truly been a deep dive into a strange and significant piece of human and, canine history.
And as one of the sources, that damn interesting article puts it so pointedly at the end, one must wonder what medical breakthroughs are looming just over the horizon, and which ones are worth the lives lost to discover them. Or maybe, building on that stark image of the isolated head, or the tough debate on consciousness and suffering, maybe we're also left to ponder something even more fundamental. What truly constitutes life? Is it just keeping physiological functions going with pumps and tubes? Or is it something more? Something including consciousness, feeling, maybe even what some call the soul. And in our relentless drive to conquer disease, delay death, extend life. What are we as individuals and as a society ultimately willing to sacrifice to get there?
Profound questions indeed. Definitely ones worth sitting with. It's fascinating. It's pretty unsettling and intensely debated.
Absolutely. We're talking about the 1940 Soviet film, Experiments in the Revival of Organisms.
Right. And this film, it really caused a stir when it came out. And honestly, it's still deeply disturbing and kind of captivating today.
It is. It presents itself as a scientific documentary, showcasing work by Soviet scientists Sergei Bryukhonenko and Boris Levinsky. They were at Moscow's Institute of Experimental Physiology and Therapy.
And their goal, as stated in the film,
Was pretty ambitious, exploring the possibility of bringing organisms back to life after clinical death.
and they really don't hold back in showing what they mean by that. The film purports to show things like keeping isolated organs alive outside the body.
Yeah, you see a heart beating, lungs inflating.
And maybe the most shocking part, reviving whole dogs after they've been, well, deliberately killed.
It sounds like pure science fiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the film presents it as hard scientific fact, straight-faced.
Exactly. And that stark presentation of these, frankly, incredible claims is precisely why there's been so much skepticism around this film for, 80 years now?
Jack, yeah.
Yeah.
So the core question, the thing that's driving this deep dive, and it comes up again and again in the sources you shared, the skeptical reviews, medical commentary, historical analyses, is this. Was this film a genuine, if maybe disturbing, record of real pioneering science?
Or was it largely staged, exaggerated, maybe even faked, for propaganda?
That's the central mystery we're trying to unpack. Was it science, or was it showmanship, or some mix of the two?
So today we're going to lay out exactly what the film claims it shows. We'll dig deep into the specific criticisms people have leveled against it, the claims of fakery from skeptics.
And then, crucially, we need to weigh those criticisms against what we know about the science and the technology that actually existed back then in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, we need to figure out if these claims of it being faked really hold up, or if maybe, just maybe, the critics are underestimating the actual science of the time, even if it was, pretty rudimentary compared to now.
It's a really tricky evaluation.
Yeah.
The film seems to deliberately blur those lines between genuine scientific ambition, the often messy reality of doing experiments, and potentially, deliberate visual tricks to make a point.
Okay, let's start with the film itself. What does Experiments in the Revival of Organisms actually show us? What are these really astonishing claims it makes, based on the sources we've got?
Well, the film seems structured quite deliberately. It builds its case step by step, starts with simpler things, supposedly, and ramps up to the really dramatic stuff.
Okay, like what?
It begins by showing footage that's meant to be isolated organs, kept alive outside a body using some kind of artificial circulation. You see these visuals described in the reviews like a dog's heart, just sitting there beating rhythmically on its own.
Wow.
And lungs expanding and contracting, all apparently powered by external machinery.
Even that first bit is pretty striking visually. I mean, it pushes the boundaries of what most people back in 1940 would have even imagined was possible.
Right. But like you said, it escalates quickly. The next segment introduces the experiment that's become the most, famous, or maybe infamous.
The severed dog's head.
Yes. The notorious severed dog's head. The film shows this head placed on a table, and the narration tells you it's connected to an artificial circulation system. Bryukhonenko's autojector, they called it.
And the claim isn't just that it's alive.
No, the explicit claim is that this disembodied head is not only being kept metabolically alive, but that it's somehow conscious, responsive.
And the film tries to offer proof of this, right? Specific moments that are supposed to show it's alive and aware.
Exactly. It shows the head apparently reacting to light. You see the pupils supposedly adjust.
Yeah.
It shows a reaction to sound. Specifically, they make a point of showing its response when someone strikes a hammer nearby. There's footage showing the head seeming to accept and swallow food described as candy, or maybe liquid.
Yeah.
And then using its tongue to lick its snout clean afterwards.
Oh, that's incredibly specific and kind of gruesome.
It is. And maybe most disturbingly, it shows the eyes tearing up when irritants are introduced nearby. It's a very deliberate sequence designed to convince you of sensory perception, basic motor function, in a head without a body.
They're really trying to hammer home the point. We've kept this head alive and conscious.
That's the clear intention. And then the film culminates in the full body revival experiment.
Okay, what does that involve?
The film shows a dog being deliberately killed, usually the sources say by exsanguination, basically draining all its blood.
Oh, wow.
And it's presented as clinically dead for a specific amount of time. And the claims in the film, as referenced in the sources, are pretty bold here. Durations like 8 minutes, 9 minutes, even up to an astonishing 15 minutes of clinical death. No vital signs.
15 minutes with no blood circulating, no breathing. That seems like an incredibly long time to claim you can bring something back from, especially without damage.
It really does, especially thinking about the brain's need for oxygen. And then the film shows the scientists using their machine, the autoinjector, to pump oxygenated blood back into this apparently dead dog.
Yeah.
And the footage purports to show the dog's vital signs returning. The heart starts beating again, the lungs start working, leading to what looks like a full revival of the whole animal.
Wow. And the film doesn't just stop at the revival itself, does it? It makes claims about what happened afterwards.
That's right. The English narration, which was done by J.B.S. Haldane, a pretty noted biologist.
Which we'll come back to.
Yeah. That narration suggests these revived dogs went on to live perfectly normal, healthy lives. Some even supposedly had families, had puppies.
Normal lives. After being clinically dead for up to 15 minutes.
That's the claim. And this claim of long-term normality is really significant because, as several sources that dig a bit deeper into Bryukhonenko's actual research notes reveal, well, this part seems heavily exaggerated, to put it mildly.
Absolutely.
Further probing into his work suggests the reality was much, much more limited, often involving significant brain damage and survival, measured in just days, maybe weeks, not years of normal, healthy life.
Okay, so that discrepancy right there between the film's happy ending story and the actual research findings, that's a huge red flag when you're trying to figure out how truthful this film is.
A critical point, definitely.
Okay, before we dive headfirst into all the skepticism, let's talk a bit more about the technology. This autoinjector machine they show, what did the sources tell us about it? Was it even plausible for the time?
It's a fair question. The film shows this kind of Heath Robinson-looking setup, doesn't it? Tubes, pumps, basins.
Yeah.
Bryukhonenko called it his autoinjector. But what's really fascinating and important to remember, even when we're talking skepticism, is that commentators who know about medical technology,
Like the perfusionist you mentioned from one source.
exactly, someone with decades of experience using modern heart-lung machines, they actually acknowledge that this system, rudimentary as it looks, represented genuinely pioneering work for its time.
Pioneering how? What did they recognize?
They see it as basically a proto-version of modern ECMO extracorporeal membrane oxygenation or even dialysis machines. You know, systems that circulate and oxygenate blood outside the body.
Okay.
The perfusionist source specifically notes that the procedures shown were, quote, certainly possible with 1940s era technology. While it was basic, the core ideas were scientifically sound for that period. The oxygenator was a simple bubbler, literally mixing oxygen gas directly with blood.
Which isn't ideal, I gather.
No, it can damage blood cells, but it works up to a point. And the pumps use principles similar to other early artificial hearts being developed around the same time elsewhere in the world too.
So the basic concept, artificially circulating blood, adding oxygen that was being explored, it was technologically feasible.
Yes, the principles were definitely understood. And crucially, as the perfusionist points out, something essential was available. Heparin.
The anticoagulant.
Right. You absolutely need that to stop the blood clotting in the machine and the tubes. And heparin became commercially available for IV use in 1936.
Okay. So that piece fits the timeline, late 1930s.
It does. It confirms that a key component needed for this kind of experiment was technologically within reach. So yeah, the machine might look clunky, maybe even inadequate by today's standards, but its basic functionality was plausible science for the era.
And then, as you mentioned, they added this layer of scientific authority by getting J.B.S. Haldane, a respected British biologist, to do the English narration.
Exactly. Haldane was a big name. Yeah. Genetics, physiology. Having his voice explaining things would have given the film significant weight and credibility, especially for Western audiences. It implies, this is serious, legitimate science endorsed by proper scientists, regardless of what was actually being shown.
Okay, so you've got these astonishing claims, this rudimentary but conceptually plausible technology, and a famous scientist narrating. That sets the stage. But for so many people who've seen this film, there's just this huge question mark hanging over it.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us squarely to the intense skepticism surrounding experiments in the revival of organisms. The sources make it clear. Many viewers, commentators, people like Ken Smith, whose notes apparently just call it fake. They just don't buy it as a straightforward scientific record.
That really is the heart of the debate. The skeptical view, which you see all over online discussions and analyses, is basically that the visual proof in the film, it just looks too convenient, too clean, maybe too contrary to basic biology to be Anything but staged or exaggerated or, outright faked.
They see it less as science, more as performance.
Something like that. Closer to stage magic, some say, than a scientific demonstration.
So what are the specific visual things that critics point to most often? What makes them say, no, this looks fake?
Almost universally, the first thing people mention is the movement of the severed head.
Right.
Critics watch that footage, and they describe the head moving in ways that they argue are just physically impossible. For a truly disembodied head, anyway. One that doesn't have a torso for leverage or anchoring.
What kind of movements are we talking about?
Things like jerking movements, twitching. Some accounts even describe it seeming to lift up slightly or turn its head in response to stimuli, like that hammer sound they demonstrate.
Okay, yeah, I can see why that would raise eyebrows.
The argument is pretty straightforward. Those kinds of actions need intact neck muscles, shoulder muscles, the counterweight of a body to provide stability and leverage. A head just sitting on a table, even if blood is flowing through it, well, just couldn't generate those kinds of relatively coordinated or forceful movements on its own.
It makes intuitive sense. Try turning your head without using your neck and shoulders. You can't really.
Exactly. And this visual observation leads directly to one of the most common, most explicit theories of how it was faked. The one often called the hole in the table theory.
Ah, okay. I've seen references to this. What's the idea?
Commentators in the sources, like users named Cash Burbage and Benjamin Ghazi 2012 in those online discussions, they explicitly suggest it was done using a simple magician's trick, an illusion.
Meaning, how would that work?
They think the filmmakers used a live dog, but one that was heavily sedated or anesthetized.
Okay.
Then they cut a hole in the table. The dog's body is hidden underneath the table, out of sight. All you see is its head, resting on the tabletop, looking like it's severed.
Ah, I see. And the tubes.
The alleged severed neck area connecting to the machine, that would just be prosthetic tubing, arranged cleverly to look like it's hooked up to the head. Meanwhile, the dog's actual body underneath is providing the real circulation, keeping the head alive. And crucially, allowing for natural reflexes, muscle tone, maybe some drug-induced movements.
Which would explain the head moving in ways that seem impossible if it were truly severed, because it isn't severed.
That's the core of the skeptical argument for that scene. A straightforward visual trick to create a sensational effect that, they argue, real science couldn't deliver at that time.
Makes sense as an explanation for the visuals. What other visual points do critics bring up?
Another common one is about the connections, or rather the lack of clearly visible connections between the head and the machine in the actual live footage.
So the film shows an animated diagram, right? Showing how the arteries are supposedly hooked up.
It does. But skeptics point out that when you look at the actual film of the head on the table, you never get a clear, unambiguous shot of those critical vascular connections, where the tubes actually meet the flesh.
They call the animated diagram dodgy in one source, like it's a bit of misdirection.
That's the implication, yes. Critics argue that a genuine scientific film documenting something this groundbreaking would meticulously show those connections being made, how the blood flow is actually established. The fact that the film is kind of shy about showing that clearly makes it seem like something's being hidden, deliberately obscured, which again supports the idea of staging.
And what about blood? You'd expect, well, a lot of blood with a decapitation.
That's mentioned too, yeah. Given the procedure, the relatively minimal appearance of blood around the severed neck area in the film strikes some people as unrealistic. Again, maybe suggesting the scene was carefully prepared, cleaned up, staged, to avoid the messy reality that might shatter the illusion.
Okay, so specific issues with the head scene. Are there broader criticisms about how the whole thing was filmed?
Absolutely. Skeptics look at the film's cinematography itself as suspicious.
How so?
The use of very tight camera shots, especially on the head, and a general lack of wider angles or camera movement. Some see this as a deliberate tactic to prevent real scrutiny.
By keeping the focus tight, you can't see the whole setup.
Exactly. You can't see if there's a body hidden. You can't see exactly how things are connected. It controls what the viewer is allowed to see. One review described the setting for the experiments as looking staged and contrived, like it was built for the camera, not necessarily for rigorous science.
So the critics are applying a filmmaker's eye too, suggesting manipulative techniques.
Definitely part of the argument. And they also analyze the behavior of the dog's head. We talked about the movement, but also just its general state. Some commentators suggest the way it responds, the reflexes, the licking, the eye tearing, actually resembles an animal under certain kinds of anesthetic, like ketamine is mentioned, or just in a sort of drug-induced haze.
How so?
The movements are sometimes described as looking involuntary or very strained, which they argue could be consistent with a sedated animal showing reflexes or muscle spasms rather than demonstrating genuine conscious willed actions.
Okay, so the visual criticisms all seem to converge on this idea. The film might be using cinematic tricks, possibly illusions like the hidden body, maybe exploiting drug effects to create the appearance of scientific success that wasn't really happening, or at least not to the extent shown.
That really sums up the visual case for fakery or significant staging, yes. But the critics don't just stop at the visuals. They also raise some pretty serious scientific challenges to the film's core claims, based on fundamental physiology.
Okay, what are the main scientific points they question?
Well, one key point, which overlaps a bit with what we discussed about the actual research results, is the claimed survival duration of the severed head.
Right, the film implies it could last for hours.
It gives that impression, yeah. But the sources that looked into Bryukhonenko's actual papers and reports suggest the reality was viability measured in mere minutes. Maybe 3.5 minutes is mentioned in one account relating to his research.
Minutes versus implying hours. That's not just exaggeration. That feels like a fundamentally different outcome.
It's a massive difference. It strongly suggests the film took the most fleeting, transient sign of life and presented it as sustained viability, which is, misleading at best.
Okay. What else on the science front?
Perhaps the biggest scientific challenge, the one some critics call the most obvious and undisputable reason to doubt the revival claims, is about brain death. Specifically, the time frame for successfully resuscitating an animal after clinical death.
Because the film claims revival after 8, 9, even 15 minutes of clinical death, and implies they recovered fully, no lasting damage.
Exactly that. Skeptics draw on what we know about oxygen deprivation, both modern medical understanding and, frankly, knowledge available even back then. They argue that irreversible brain death happens very quickly without blood flow carrying oxygen and glucose.
What's the usual time frame cited?
For humans, the widely accepted window before severe irreversible damage sets in is around 4 to 6 minutes of no oxygen. Dogs might have slightly different tolerances, but the core physiology is similar.
So 15 minutes.
15 minutes of complete clinical death. No circulation at all. According to this skeptical view, that's just far, far beyond the point where a complex brain could possibly be revived without devastating permanent damage. The idea of a full recovery after that length of time seems fundamentally implausible.
From a basic physiological standpoint, both then and now.
That's the powerful argument they make. It seems to fly in the face of biological reality.
Are there other specific scientific points raised?
Yes, a couple more. One review mentioned brings up heart function. It suggests that a severed heart actually needs neural input, like a pacemaker signal from the brain, and wouldn't just keep beating or restart spontaneously if you pumped blood through it.
But you mentioned earlier that other sources specifically counter that point.
That's right, and it's an important nuance we definitely need to address when we weigh everything up. It highlights how even scientific criticisms can sometimes be based on incomplete understanding.
Okay. What else?
Finally, some critics question the machine itself, the autojector. They look at the depiction in the film and suggest that while the idea of a heart-lung machine was emerging, the specific device shown looks too small, too simple.
Too inadequate.
Yeah, inadequate to provide enough oxygenation, enough pumping power to actually sustain or revive a whole dog, especially for extended periods, or after that claimed 15 minutes of oxygen debt. They compare it implicitly or explicitly to modern machines, which are much larger and more complex.
So the argument is, even if the concept wasn't totally impossible, that machine looks like it couldn't possibly have delivered those results.
That's one line of argument, yes. And wrapping around all of this criticism, the visual questions, the scientific challenges, is the inescapable context. This film came out of Soviet Russia in 1940.
Right, the propaganda angle.
Exactly. Many sources view this film, at least partly, as a piece of deliberate Soviet propaganda.
Designed to impress the world with Soviet scientific might.
That's the most common interpretation. It's seen as blending fact and fiction very cleverly, as one source puts it. Aimed perhaps at a global audience that, before World War II really ramped up, might have been technologically a bit naive, and therefore more easily impressed by sensational claims presented visually.
So it's a showcase, a demonstration of Soviet prowess, mastering life and death itself.
A powerful visual statement to that effect. But interestingly, there's also a counter theory mentioned in the sources that maybe the film was circulated in the West, perhaps even shown in some U.S. schools, according to one comment not by the Soviets promoting themselves, but by Western powers.
For what purpose? The opposite kind of propaganda.
Precisely. To portray the Soviets as barbaric or inhumane, using the shock value of the animal experiments to paint a negative picture of their society and ethics.
Wow. So the same disturbing footage could be spun in completely opposite ways depending on who was showing it and why.
It really highlights how the interpretation and use of scientific imagery can be deeply political, doesn't it?
It does. And Haldane's involvement, the narrator, how does that fit into the propaganda view?
Well, given that J.B.S. Haldane was a known member of the Communist Party of Great Britain at the time,
Okay.
some critics, looking back, suggest he might have been used, perhaps unwittingly, as a useful idiot, lending his prestigious scientific name and voice to promote these potentially falsified or exaggerated Soviet achievements, possibly without fully realizing the extent of the manipulation involved.
So the skepticism is coming from multiple angles. Visual analysis suggesting trickery, scientific arguments about physiological impossibility, and the historical context pointing towards propaganda. It feels like a pretty strong case against taking the film at face value.
It's definitely a robust and compelling set of arguments, and they explain why the film remains so controversial. However, and this is where it gets complicated again, we have to connect this back to the bigger picture. It's crucial to weigh these criticisms against the actual scientific foundation that did exist then, which the sources also describe. This wasn't just pulled out of thin air.
Right. You mentioned earlier, despite all the claims of fakery, there was real pioneering science happening in this area in the Soviet Union at the time.
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge that Sergei Bryukhonenko, based on the historical accounts in our sources, was a genuine and pretty significant pioneer in artificial circulation. He did develop one of the very earliest functional heart-lung machines, his autojector, starting way back in the 1920s.
So the machine itself wasn't just invented for the film.
No, it was the result of years of actual research. And his work did involve experiments on animals, trying to sustain life with artificial circulation, exploring resuscitation. These were real research programs.
And this work wasn't just some weird dead end. It actually led somewhere important.
That's what the sources indicate. They state that Bryukhonenko's research and his autojector literally paved the way for our modern artificial life support machines. His work fed into the development of things we rely on today, like heart bypass surgery, organ transplant support, ECMO for respiratory failure.
Wow. So the fundamental scientific pursuit shown in the film, developing technology to take over heart and lung function, trying to reverse death that was real, valuable science, foundational even.
It seems so. Experiments on isolated organs, attempts at revivals from clinical death. These were legitimate, if obviously ethically fraught, areas of physiological research in that era. They were pushing boundaries.
Okay, so the basic research premise was real science. Even if the film's specific depiction of the results might be questionable, let's go back to some of the specific scientific criticisms the skeptics raised. How does the context of the 1930s and 40s science, and maybe some finer details from the sources, add nuance to those? What about that big one, the claim that the brain dies in just a few minutes, making 15-minute revivals impossible?
Right. This is where it gets really interesting, and the perfusionist reviewer provides a crucial perspective here. While it's true that lack of oxygen, anoxia, damages the brain very quickly, their point is that the brain cells don't necessarily all die instantly after 4-6 minutes.
What happens instead?
What happens is the brain tissue builds up severe acidosis. It becomes very acidic, which is highly damaging. Now, the reviewer explains that if you then suddenly restart circulation and oxygen flow after this period,
Like they show in the film.
yeah, the brain often suffers what's called reperfusion injury. It's like the sudden rush of blood flow into the damaged tissue causes even more harm, often leading to cell death.
Okay, so just restarting the pump isn't necessarily the answer.
It can actually make things worse after prolonged anoxia. However, and this is a critical point the perfusionist raises, they state that if the brain is rapidly cooled during or before reperfusion begins, the reperfusion injury can be controlled and the brain brought back to life without damage.
Rapid cooling, therapeutic hypothermia, that's a concept used today, isn't it? To protect the brain after cardiac arrest or stroke.
It is. And the idea of using cooling to reduce metabolic rate and preserve tissues wasn't unknown back then either, even if the techniques were rudimentary. The perfusionist suggests that under these conditions, anoxia plus rapid cooling, before or during reperfusion, the brain might not become irreversibly non-viable for, quote, about 30 minutes.
30 minutes, wow. That's a much longer potential window than the 4-6 minutes the skeptics focus on.
It is significantly longer. Now, this doesn't automatically mean the film's claim of successful revival after 15 minutes with no brain damage is true. The evidence we discussed from Bryukhonenko's actual results strongly suggests brain damage was a major problem and full recovery wasn't happening. But it provides a potential theoretical physiological basis, a reason why researchers in the 30s and 40s, exploring the very edges of knowledge, might have believed that attempts at revival after these longer periods were worth trying, especially if they were experimenting with mitigating factors like cooling, even if they hadn't perfected it for full recovery.
So it suggests they weren't necessarily just ignoring basic physiology. They might have been operating on a more complex understanding, exploring possibilities related to acidosis, reperfusion injury, and maybe protective measures like cooling.
That seems plausible. It suggests the attempt itself, based on the understanding of the time, wasn't necessarily impossible science, even if the outcome depicted in the film was a significant overstatement of their actual success. The skepticism based purely on the 4-6 minute rule might be slightly too simplistic, missing these nuances.
Okay, that adds a lot of context to the brain viability question. What about the other scientific point, the claim that a severed heart needs a brain pacemaker to beat? You said that was countered.
Yeah, that one seems more straightforwardly incorrect based on basic cardiac physiology explained in the sources. The heart has its own intrinsic pacemaker.
The SA node, right?
Exactly, the sinoatrial node. It's specialized muscle tissue within the heart itself that initiates the heartbeat. The nervous system, including signals from the brain, modulates the heart rate and the strength of the contractions, speeds it up, slows it down, but it doesn't start the beat itself.
So a heart removed from the body if you keep it supplied with oxygenated blood.
It will continue to beat on its own at its intrinsic rhythm, at least for a while. So that particular skeptical point, suggesting the heart couldn't beat without the brain connection, just doesn't hold up to biological fact.
Okay, so that criticism seems invalid. Now, how about the argument that the machine, the autojector itself, looked too simple, too inadequate for the job?
Well, again, the perfusionist source gives perspective here. While acknowledging it looks primitive to us now, they confirm its basic design principles. The bubbler oxygenator, the mechanical pumps were indeed similar to other early artificial heart-lung devices being developed concurrently, including in the US.
Or it was typical for the time?
It seems so. The argument isn't really that this specific machine shown was perfectly efficient or could sustain a dog indefinitely without issues. Clearly, based on the actual limited survival times and brain damage reported in Bryukhonenko's research, it couldn't. Early machines were less efficient than modern ones.
What kind of problems did they have?
They could damage blood cells, like we said about the bubbler. They probably struggled with precise control over blood flow rates. Maybe they didn't achieve optimal oxygen levels consistently. All these limitations would absolutely contribute to poor outcomes. Limited survival, organ damage, brain injury.
Which sounds exactly like the actual results suggested by the deeper look into his work.
Precisely. So the machine's apparent simplicity and potential inadequacy might actually explain the limited success and severe complications found in reality, rather than proving the entire concept was fake. It reflects the genuine technological limitations of the 1940s, which would naturally lead to outcomes far less rosy than the film portrays.
Okay, that makes sense. The machine's limitations led to poor real results, which the film then glossed over or exaggerated. Now, going back to those striking visual criticisms, the head movement, the lack of clear connections, the hole in the table theory is compelling for explaining the movement. Do the sources offer any other possible explanations short of outright fakery?
They do acknowledge other possibilities, yes. Though whether they fully explain what some critics claim they see is debatable. For the head movement, there's the possibility of residual muscle tissue in the severed neck stump being capable of some limited involuntary twitching or reflex responses, perhaps stimulated by the procedure or irritants.
Like muscle spasms.
Something like that. Also, the point raised by some skeptics themselves that the animal might be drugged or anesthetized could potentially explain some abnormal muscle tone or reflex movements that look like purposeful action, but are actually involuntary physiological responses.
But maybe not the coordinated turning or lifting some describe.
Perhaps not. It's hard to judge definitively just from the grainy footage and descriptions. These alternative explanations, residual reflexes, drug effects might account for some minor movements, but whether they explain the full extent of what critics report seeing is unclear. And the lack of clearly visible vascular connections still remains a visually suspicious element from a transparent documentary perspective.
So it seems there's a spectrum. From minor explainable biological twitches, potentially amplified by drugs, all the way to the deliberate staging implied by the hidden body theory. The film itself leaves enough ambiguity for all these interpretations to emerge.
I think that's fair. And this brings us right back to comparing the film's narrative to the reality that seems to emerge from digging into Bryukhonenko's actual work, like those sources discussing minutes of head survival, not hours, and days of brain-damaged life for the revived dogs, not normal, happy lives.
That stark contrast really feels key. It suggests the film wasn't necessarily a total fabrication from scratch.
Probably not.
But rather, it was a highly selective, significantly dramatized, maybe even, as one source put it, rose-tinted presentation, taking very limited, transient, maybe ethically troubling results and blowing them up into a narrative of complete triumph over death.
That seems to be the most balanced conclusion the evidence points towards.
What? Yeah.
The phrase dramatized is not faked comes up, but the level of dramatization here seems so extreme that it becomes fundamentally misleading about the actual state of the science and its success at that moment.
So let's try to evaluate the validity of the criticisms overall. The skepticism seems really well-founded when it attacks the degree of success the film claims. 15-minute revivals with full recovery, normal lives afterwards, severed heads viable for hours. That seems highly unlikely based on the actual research context.
Agreed. The exaggeration of outcomes seems undeniable.
And the visual evidence. There are definitely elements, the head movement, the obscured connections that provide plausible grounds for suspicion of staging or manipulation. Critics pointing these out are using reasonable physiological intuition and valid observations about how films can be constructed to persuade or deceive.
Yes, the visual case for staging, particularly in the head scene, is strong, even if not definitively proven beyond all doubt by the footage alone.
However, maybe some critics go too far if they dismiss the entire premise as scientifically impossible based only on a simplified view of, say, brain death occurring strictly at 4 to 6 minutes.
That's where the nuance comes back in. Those critics might be underestimating the contemporary theoretical understanding, even in the 30s and 40s, about more complex factors, like the role of acidosis, reperfusion injury, and potential protective strategies like cooling, which sources suggest could, at least in theory, extend the window of potential viability, even if they hadn't mastered achieving undamaged recovery within that window.
So the underlying research wasn't necessarily bunk science, even if the film presented its results in a misleadingly positive light.
Exactly. The film seems like this complex artifact. It's built on a foundation of real, genuinely groundbreaking research into artificial circulation and resuscitation work that was valuable and did contribute to later medicine.
That foundation is presented through a lens of significant dramatic exaggeration, possibly some visual staging to smooth over the messy reality, and almost certainly shaped by the political need to showcase Soviet scientific achievement.
Its truthfulness just isn't a simple yes or no. It's layered, it's complicated.
And it's worth remembering briefly that this kind of ambitious, boundary-pushing, ethically challenging research wasn't unique to this film or Soviet Russia. You mentioned Robert J. White's experiments later on.
Yeah, his monkey head transplants in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s. They're mentioned in a source as a later parallel. He managed to keep the heads alive, demonstrating neurological function above the neck, seeing, hearing, tasting, but the animals remained paralyzed below the neck because spinal cord connection wasn't achieved.
Still disturbing, but it shows the idea of exploring these extreme possibilities persisted in mainstream science even decades later. Puts the Soviet film's subject matter, however exaggerated its portrayal, into a broader, albeit still controversial, historical scientific context.
It does. These ideas were being explored.
Okay, stepping back from the science versus skepticism debate for a moment, the sources also bring up broader reflections prompted by the film, particularly around the ethics of it all.
Yes, you really can't watch this film or even discuss it without confronting the ethical questions. The experiments shown are, by today's standards, certainly quite brutal towards the animals involved, and the commentary and reviews reflect that ethical discomfort.
The sources present differing viewpoints on this, don't they?
They do. On one hand, some viewers or commentators argue that these difficult experiments, even if they cause suffering, were perhaps a necessary evil. Steps that ultimately led to vital medical progress. They point directly to Bryukhonenko's work on the autojector, feeding into modern life support, transplant techniques, things that save countless human lives now.
The ends justify the means argument, essentially.
That's one perspective presented. The idea that the significant positive outcomes for human health might, in historical context, justify the ethically challenging methods used in that earlier era, which had different standards for animal research.
But there's another side presented too.
Absolutely. Other commentators strongly condemn the experiments as simply cruel and question whether they were even truly necessary. Could the same scientific knowledge have been gained through less harmful means? This view places a much higher value on animal welfare, emphasizing the capacity of these animals to suffer, and argues that the methods themselves are ethically unacceptable, regardless of any eventual human benefit.
So it reflects that ongoing tension. How do we judge past research by today's ethics? Does the utility of the outcome outweigh the ethical cost of the method?
Exactly. The sources present these as viewpoints raised in the discussion about the film, reflecting that complex ethical debate that continues today around animal research.
And there was one other more philosophical angle mentioned in a source, something about world making.
Yes, an interesting idea drawing on the philosopher Nelson Goodman. It suggests we shouldn't evaluate the film's claims only by a single strict standard of scientific fact, especially not just a modern Western scientific standard.
Why not?
The idea is that the film's claims might indeed seem like a hoax built upon Western scientific predicates, meaning they don't neatly fit the rules and observed realities of conventional science as we might define it.
But maybe they operated differently in a different context, a different world.
Exactly. Perhaps the film held a different kind of truth or served a crucial function within the specific world of Soviet political ambition and its propaganda needs. In that world, the visual demonstration of mastery, the perception of success, might have been the primary goal, even if the unvarnished scientific reality was far messier and less successful.
Or even within the world of early experimental physiology itself.
Right, a world where scientists were aggressively pushing into unknown territory, exploring the very boundaries of life and death with rudimentary tools. In that context, results were often uncertain, maybe open to interpretation, perhaps even subject to hopeful exaggeration as they reached for breakthroughs.
So the film's truth isn't just about whether it accurately recorded objective facts, but also about how it functioned, how it created a reality or shaped perception within its specific cultural, political, and scientific contexts. It was a tool for making a certain kind of world visible.
It's a lens that lets us move beyond just asking, was it fake? And prompts us to ask, what was it doing? How did it operate? And what reality did it construct for its viewers?
This has been a truly fascinating, if unsettling, deep dive. We've journeyed through the absolutely incredible claims made in experiments in the Revival of Organisms. We've meticulously picked apart the way skeptics have challenged its authenticity, pointing to those suspicious visuals, the head movements, the missing connections, and questioning the basic scientific plausibility around brain death timelines and machine capabilities.
And importantly, we've weighed all that skepticism against the actual scientific context of the 1930s and 40s, drawing on details from the sources that confirm Bryukhonenko's work was real, it was pioneering, and it did contribute to modern medicine. We saw how some skeptical arguments, while right to question the film's depiction of success, might slightly underestimate the era's more complex theoretical understanding of things like extending brain viability, perhaps through methods like cooling.
So our conclusion, leaning heavily on the sources, seems to be that this film is this really complex blend. It's built on a foundation of genuine, groundbreaking science, but that science is then overlaid with, well, significant dramatic exaggeration, quite possibly some deliberate visual staging to hide the limitations or enhance the apparent results, and it's all clearly shaped by the need to project an image of Soviet scientific power.
Yeah, the skeptics are almost certainly correct that the film does not give you a straightforward, unvarnished scientific reality, especially about how long things survived or how successful the revivals truly were. But at the same time, the underlying research wasn't pseudoscience. It was a real, if difficult, step forward in medical history, even if the actual outcomes were far rougher and more ethically challenging than the film admits. The film's truth is really tangled up in that space between ambition, limitation, and presentation.
Which leaves us, and you, our listener, with some really provocative questions to think about, questions that go way beyond just this one old Soviet film. How should we evaluate the ethics and the validity of historical science? Do we judge it by the standards of its time or by ours? Does the eventual good that came from some early, maybe controversial experiments justify the methods used, especially on animals? Or should the methods themselves always be the primary ethical concern?
And what is a film like this one, sitting right at that blurry intersection of science, spectacle, maybe propaganda? What does it tell us about the power of visual representation? How images shape our understanding or misunderstanding of scientific ambition and perceived truth, both historically and even today. We're going to look at what people online, decades later, are saying about this film. How does that stack up against, older perspectives? And how do the debates it sparked then connect directly to things we almost take for granted now? Like heart-lung machines, organ transplants, even some really cutting-edge brain research. It's a deep dive into that messy spot where science, shock, and our moral compass all collide.
Yeah, that intersection.
So let's get into it, using these sources as our guide.
Let's do it.
Okay, kicking off, how does this film hit people? First encounter, what's that immediate gut reaction we see in the sources, like on Reddit or the Internet Archive?
Well, the dominant feeling overwhelmingly is shock, disgust, sadness. It's clear the visuals, the severed head, the whole idea of bringing animals back, it just cuts right to the core for so many viewers.
Right.
And the focus is immediately, intensely on the suffering of the animals, or the perceived suffering.
You see it straight away, don't you? Just glancing through those Reddit comments, the words just jump out. Horrible, sick fucks, disturbing. Someone literally says it's the worst thing I have ever seen.
Yeah.
It's just raw, unfiltered emotion, really unsettling stuff.
And it's the same over on the Internet Archive reviews, sometimes with a bit more, explanation. People write things like, "This experiment makes me so sad. It is called animal cruelty." One reviewer just flat out says, "This film documents evil." Another gives a warning, "Yitch, do not watch this if you have a weak stomach." The level of distress, the moral outrage, it's really palpable.
And it seems especially intense for people who feel close to animals, right? That Reddit comment, "As a dog lover, this makes me indescribably sad." That hits hard.
It really does. That personal connection just amplifies the horror.
And you even see conflict starting right there in the comments. One user pointed out, people were downvoting comments expressing sadness about the cruelty.
Right, which highlights that immediate split in how people process this. Some feel this intense empathy, this connection, and others seem to, dismiss it or push back against it.
Yeah.
So the visuals, the severed head seeming to react, or just the idea of keeping organs going outside a body, it triggers this powerful emotional response. And it centers on the animal's suffering, its possible awareness.
People jump right to that, don't they? Questioning consciousness.
Exactly. Someone asks, "It seems conscious," and you immediately get that heartbroken reply, "I hope not."
Oh, wow.
Another wonders, "I wonder if the dog was still awake and aware. He was probably so scared if he was." And that comment, imagining the dog thinking, "They kept my head and chopped off everything. Oh God, please make them hear me." It's incredibly vivid. Horrifying.
Yeah.
It speaks to that deep fear of being trapped, aware, but helpless.
That level of empathy, focusing on the inherent wrongness of causing suffering, even if there's some potential scientific goal. It makes me think of one of the ethical ideas mentioned in the article's deontology. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah.
How does that view apply here?
Sure. So deontology basically is an ethical theory that says the morality of an action depends on whether it follows certain rules or duties. It's not about the consequences, it's about the act itself.
Right, the act itself is right or wrong.
Exactly. So from a deontological standpoint, causing what looks like intense suffering to a defenseless animal that's seen as wrong in itself. It breaks a moral rule against cruelty, and it doesn't matter if it might lead to some good outcome later. The act of inflicting that suffering is the core moral problem. Full stop.
And that deep sense of wrongness seems to be what makes people instantly connect this film to other historical horrors, right? Like it unlocks this catalog of awful experiments.
It really does. The discussion widens very quickly. People on Reddit immediately bring up Unit 731.
Ah, the Japanese military program.
Yeah, the human experimentation in WWII. They use chilling terms. Super fucked up testing on live humans. Atrocious evil things, calling it a nightmare factory.
Yeah.
They mention horrible details like calling people logs, just complete dehumanization.
And it's not just Unit 731. They mention Nazi experiments too, obviously.
Right, those are sort of the go-to examples of horrific medical cruelty.
But the critique isn't just aimed at, wartime enemies. Commenters point fingers closer to home, too, mentioning the U.S. has done some fucked up shit, too.
They cite horrible human and animal experiments without people's consent, specifically mentioning vulnerable groups, soldiers, mentally ill, animals, and other vulnerable populations.
Are there specific examples given?
Yeah, really disturbing ones. Allegations of experiments on Black people without anesthesia based on racist beliefs about pain tolerance.
Oh, God.
And doing surgery on newborns without pain management, which shockingly apparently happened in the U.S. until the 1980s.
The 80s. Wow, that's jarring.
It really is. So it shows how seeing something like this 1940 film isn't isolated for viewers. It immediately makes them think about this wider, often really grim history of scientific cruelty, state-sponsored stuff across different times and places.
It makes you ask, were the Soviet experiments unique or just one example of this pattern of crossing ethical lines for science or politics or war?
Exactly. One commenter puts it bluntly. Everyone did shit like this, especially in wartime, and broadens it. I think all societies have done stuff like this.
And another points out it's not just history either.
Right, that comment. Literally everywhere, all the time. As we speak, people are injecting rats, pigs, apes, and monkeys with drugs to test them. It brings it right into the present.
So for many people, the shock isn't just about this one specific film. It's like a reminder of this capacity for cruelty when science or the state overrides basic compassion. And that capacity isn't limited to one time or place.
No, it resonates on that fundamental level of confronting suffering and asking, where do we draw the line? How do societies decide what's acceptable in the name of finding things out?
Okay, so there's the ethical horror, the historical context, but then there's another layer too, right? People questioning if the film is even real.
Yeah, that comes up straight away. You get people on the Internet Archive just flat out calling it fake, a crude fake, or dismissing it as pure nonsense.
They just don't believe it could have happened.
Basically. They look at the claims through a modern lens of biology and just find them totally unbelievable.
What are the main scientific sticking points for them?
A big one is brain death. You know, how quickly the brain deteriorates without oxygen. One commenter puts it clearly. Irreversible brain death takes mere minutes. Not likely that revival would be possible after 10 minutes without severe negative effects.
Right, the brain needs that constant oxygen supply.
Exactly. Human brain cells, especially neurons, they need glucose and oxygen constantly. Without blood flow, serious damage starts super fast, like within 4 to 6 minutes at normal temperatures. So the film showing dogs revived after 8, 9, even 15 minutes of clinical death, it just seems impossible to some people based on that understanding.
And the visuals themselves raise questions too, especially that shot of the severed head reacting.
Oh yeah, definitely. People point to what they see as physical impossibilities, like how can a head lift up or twitch without a neck?
Right. No muscles, no spine.
Exactly. One person asks, how can a dog head severed from the neck twitch and lift up when there's no neck to lift it? They figure it must be faked, manipulated somehow. Even the perfusionist, we'll talk about later, notes how much the head moves, which seems surprising.
So beyond the science, some people think it was maybe just staged. Soviet propaganda.
That theory is definitely out there. The reviewer calling it a crude fake suggests it wasn't just bad science, but deliberate fabrication. Maybe even slipped into US schools to make the commies look barbaric during the Cold War.
Oh, interesting theory.
Yeah, or maybe to make them look technologically advanced, impressive. Another points to the narrator, J.B.S. Haldane. He was a famous scientist, but also a Communist Party member.
Okay, so that connection fuels the propaganda idea.
It does for some, yeah. They suggest maybe it was a well-performed farce, a mix of fact and fiction designed to fool Western audiences who might not have known better about the technology in 1940.
Okay, so the initial reactions are incredibly complex. You've got the gut punch of ethical horror, seeing it in the context of historical cruelty, and this strong vein of skepticism. Is it real? Is it fake? Is it propaganda?
It really hits on multiple levels simultaneously, the emotional, the ethical, the historical, and just basic questions about the reality of what you're seeing on screen. It definitely demands a response, and, well, those responses are all over the map.
Right. But, okay, despite that immediate shock, the disgust, the skepticism, there's another whole side to this, isn't there? People defending the film, defending the experiments based on scientific value, contribution to progress.
Exactly. And this is where you see a very different ethical framework coming into play. It's a direct contrast to that deontological view we talked about, the one focused on the act itself being wrong.
This is more like utilitarianism.
Precisely. Utilitarianism judges actions based purely on their consequences. The goal is to maximize overall good happiness, well-being, whatever, or minimize suffering for the largest number of individuals involved.
So the argument becomes, okay, maybe the animal suffering was bad, even regrettable, but it was a necessary cost for breakthroughs that saved countless human lives later. The end justifies the means, basically.
That's the core utilitarian defense you see over and over in the comments. And even in some historical takes, you get phrases like, research was worth the cost in dogs, or not a worthless die, instead dead for science.
Yeah.
In that statement, some sacrifices are necessary for the name of science and medicine. It directly says the outcome outweighs the method, especially when it's animals sacrificed for human benefit.
And they're not just talking vaguely about benefits, right? They connect it to specific modern medical stuff.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Reviewers say things like, this is the basis for all modern dialysis and transfusions, suggesting a direct line from those old perfusion experiments to treatments we use every day. Others even suggest the footage could still be useful. Like, vets might watch it to even examine on how to save another dog's heart by transplant, highlighting a possible link to actual surgical techniques.
Okay, and that comment from the self-described real perfusionist, the person who actually uses heart-lung machines today, that offers a pretty strong counter to the skepticism, right? Defending the technical possibility.
It really does. Their comment is quite detailed, and it adds a layer of credibility. They state pretty clearly, I've used heart-lung pumps for over 40 years. The procedures pictured here certainly are possible with 1940s era technology.
What details did they give? How could it have been possible?
Well, they explain the oxygenator scene in the film was likely a simple bubbler type, just bubbling oxygen through blood. Primitive, but it works. And the pumps. They say they look similar in principle to modern ventricular assist devices, VADs, used to help failing hearts.
Okay, and what about the brain death issue? The skepticism that the brain couldn't survive that long without oxygen.
Right, the perfusionist tackles that head on. They explain that yes, suddenly giving oxygen back after it's been cut off does cause damage. It's called reperfusion injury. It can kill brain cells, but crucially, that damage can be controlled, minimized, especially by rapidly cooling the brain.
Hypothermia. Cooling the body down buys time.
Exactly. This expert's best educated guess, based on their experience, is that a mammal brain might not be irreversibly damaged for maybe 30 minutes without oxygen if you use cooling. It gives you a window to get the patient on a pump, cool them down, fix blood chemistry before permanent damage sets in.
So their point is, the revival shown after 10 or 15 minutes in the film, it's not totally impossible, especially if they knew about cooling or if their work led to understanding it later.
Precisely. It suggests that while maybe pushing the limits, it wasn't necessarily scientifically absurd, particularly with that potential factor of cooling.
And the connection to organ transplants is another major point for the defenders, right?
Huge point. Comments say things like, limb and head transplants. The experiments were quite useful and played a role in modern-day limb transplants. Or, more broadly, that the experiments paved the way for organ transplants and CPR, framing it as essential groundwork.
And one of the articles we looked at confirms that historical link pretty directly, mentioning Bryukhonenko's machine, the autojector.
It does. It says the autojector paved the way for our modern artificial life support machines. And it emphasizes this work ultimately led to surgeries we take for granted today.
And then it asks that question.
Yeah, that really thought-provoking question. Without these men, it's only a guess as to when life support machines or heart transplants would have become a possibility, which is a direct utilitarian argument. Maybe this uncomfortable research was indispensable.
There's also this broader idea in the comments that maybe uncomfortable, even ghastly experiments are just part of the deal, necessary for real breakthroughs.
Yeah, some people seem to view modern science as maybe too cautious, too tied up in rules. One reviewer says, this is what is lacking in today's science, suggesting pharma companies aren't investing in breakthrough science like this, implying the ethical hurdles stop bold experiments.
So they see the 1940 stuff as bold, even if disturbing.
Seems like it. Another commenter acknowledges the tension, saying, scientific progression should always go hand in hand with humanity progression, but then adds, progression is nigh impossible without any kind of experimentation.
So the idea is the moral queasiness is just the price of admission for the benefits we get later. The greater good argument again.
Very much so. If these experiments, however cruel they seem, led to life support or transplant saving millions, was the animal sacrifice justified? That's the question they're posing.
Someone puts it very bluntly. Ethical is nice, but sometimes one must crack a few eggs for progress.
Oof, yeah, stark. But it captures that perspective clearly. Practical results might require uncomfortable actions.
And another links it right back. If this paved the way for organ transplants and CPR, then the dogs didn't die in vain. Their suffering had a higher purpose from that viewpoint.
It's framed as a contribution.
There's that one Reddit comment that sums up the tension really well.
Yeah, the one saying these videos pose an interesting ethical dilemma because the benefits seem clear, maybe outweighing the initial cost, but on the same hand, the horror is undeniable.
And they say that applies to nearly every major medical advancement.
Right, which suggests this isn't unique to this one film, but a recurring pattern in the history of science. The undeniable horror versus the undeniable benefits.
So the defense isn't really saying it wasn't horrible. It's more like it was horrible but necessary for progress. A cold calculation almost.
It's definitely a perspective that forces you to look very pragmatically at the potential cost of scientific advancement.
Okay, so this whole debate, is it cruelty or is it necessary science? It seems to really boil down to how people view the animals themselves, right? Their moral status.
Exactly, that's fundamental. How much moral weight do these animals carry in the equation?
We saw in those first reactions, lots of people clearly see the dogs as having high moral status, calling them defenseless, feeling empathy, especially dog lovers. They see them as subjects who suffer, who deserve consideration.
Right, they're seen not just as objects or tools, but as beings with their own capacity for experience, particularly suffering. This fits with that idea of a moral patient or a passive moral subject.
Can you remind us what that means again?
Sure. A moral patient is basically a being that deserves moral respect, maybe has rights or we have duties towards them, even if they can't reason morally or have duties themselves, like infants or people with severe cognitive disabilities and arguably animals.
So they're owed moral consideration by others.
Exactly. The debate then becomes about how much consideration and when, if ever, can our duties towards them be overridden by other things, like potential benefits for humans.
And then the other side, the utilitarian defense, often seems to place animals lower on that moral scale.
Implicitly or explicitly, yes. That allows the justification for using them for human benefit to work more easily. Remember that comment comparing lab animals to food?
Yeah, better than just being a hamburger, isn't it?
Right. That tries to justify lab use by saying, well, we already kill animals for food, which is arguably less important than saving human lives through medicine. So if we accept eating meat, we should definitely accept animal research.
The underlying assumption being that using them for medicine is a higher purpose.
Or at least an equally justifiable one, if not more so, than using them for food.
This sounds a lot like speciesism, that term from one of the sources.
It absolutely touches on it. Speciesism is defined as basically prioritizing your own species, considering humans morally superior. The utilitarian argument, especially when it weighs human benefit much heavier than animal suffering, often relies on that kind of speciesist viewpoint, whether people realize it or not. Human well-being just gets assigned more value in the calculation.
And you even see arguments within the comments about whether animals can really think or feel pain like humans do, which affects how much moral weight people give them.
Yeah, someone flat out claims animals have no degree of thought, calling it a proven fact.
Which gets challenged.
Right. Oh, yeah. Others jump in, pointing to all the scientific evidence for animal consciousness, complex behaviors, and they make the point that measuring pain is hard even in humans. We rely on observable signs, self-reports. Just because animals can't talk doesn't mean they don't suffer.
And that Bentham quote comes up.
Right, Jeremy Bentham. The colon is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer. It's used constantly to argue that the capacity for suffering is the real basis for moral consideration. If something can suffer, we shouldn't inflict unnecessary suffering on it, regardless of its intelligence or ability to speak.
This ties into the history of animal research regulation too, doesn't it? How society's view has shifted, but maybe imperfectly.
Definitely. The sources talk about the U.S. Animal Welfare Act of 1966. That was a big deal, partly triggered by public outrage over things like Pepper the stolen family dog ending up in research.
People were upset about pets being used.
Yeah, the idea of a beloved companion animal in a lab really struck a nerve. But interestingly, that first act in 66 mostly focused on regulating dealers, licensing facilities, setting minimum standards for housing, food, basic care, stuff around the actual experiment.
Not the experiment itself.
No, that's the crucial part. The source says the act explicitly did not set standards for handling, care, or treatment during actual research or experimentation. It uses that really striking metaphor, calling it like a sex manual that covers foreplay but says nothing about intercourse itself.
So it regulated the cage, but not what happened on the operating table, basically.
Pretty much. It suggests the initial focus was maybe more on public perception, basic welfare, not fundamentally challenging the research procedures themselves. Now, amendments in 1970 did add requirements for anesthesia, pain relief, tranquilizers.
Okay, that's better.
But even then, initially, facilities could basically just say they didn't think pain relief was needed for a particular painful experiment.
Seriously. They could just opt out of pain relief if they decided it wasn't necessary for the research.
In the early implementation, yeah. It highlights how slowly and imperfectly the legal framework caught up with changing ethical sensitivities. And the article points out that even today, the laws often have this underlying assumption.
What's that?
That the importance of the scientific question takes precedence over the welfare of the animals. Institutional committees can reject protocols that seem too harsh, but the legal foundation arguably still prioritizes the science goal.
And didn't the source say the initial act mostly covered animals people find appealing, like dogs and cats?
Yes, exactly. Which again shows how public emotion played a role, maybe more than a universal principle about suffering. There's that wild anecdote from a USDA inspector in the 70s.
Oh, was that?
They said they could cite someone for improperly disposing of a dead dog, but couldn't do anything about a scientist they saw literally biting the heads off live mice.
Oh my God.
It just shows the arbitrary lines drawn, focusing on certain animals or practices that upset the public, rather than the capacity to suffer itself.
So the arguments we see swirling around the 1940 film online, the horror, the claims of necessity, the ethics versus progress debate, it's basically mirroring this long, ongoing societal wrestling match.
Absolutely. It reflects that gradual, messy evolution in how we view animals in research, driven partly by public feeling, partly by ethics, but always balanced against the drive for scientific knowledge. It's a tension that shaped decades of science and policy.
And clearly, based on the film reactions, it's a tension that's still very much alive.
Far from over, yeah.
Okay, so bringing this forward. These questions from a 1940 film, they're not just academic history, are they? They connect directly to stuff happening right now in medicine and science.
Oh, absolutely. They resonate deeply. Things like resuscitation, life support, even cutting-edge brain research. That film, in its primitive and shocking way, really feels like an ancestor to technologies and ethical dilemmas we face today. We saw commenters making those links immediately. The auto-ejector machine to modern heart-lung machines, the revival attempts to organ transplants. And the sources confirmed Bryukhonenko's work was foundational.
It really was a direct precursor to modern artificial life support. Those machines that oxygenate and circulate blood outside the body. Standard and complex surgeries now, like bypasses or transplants, they let surgeons work on a still heart. That tech owes a debt to those early controversial experiments.
And the whole reviving after clinical death thing. That's basically modern resuscitation, right? CPR and all that.
Exactly. One reviewer pointed that out. Today, these procedures are commonly performed. Humans have been revived after over an hour. Today, we call this resuscitation, CPR.
What looked like sci-fi horror in 1940 is now standard emergency procedure.
Pretty much. And that reviewer mentioned the successes with drowning victims, especially kids, in cold water, which links back to what the perfusionist said about cooling.
Right. The cold slows everything down, buys more time for the brain.
Precisely. Cold is protective. And this whole idea of bringing back function to tissue we thought was irreversibly dead. It's not just about cardiac arrest, it's happening at the cellular level now. That article about scientists giving dead brains new life.
Yeah, the CESTAN research at Yale, that sounds straight out of science fiction, but it's real. How does that connect back to the 1940 film's concepts?
Well, obviously the methods and ethics are worlds apart, but the core ambition is similar, restoring function to biological material after death. CESTAN's team developed that BrainX system to perfuse whole pig brains hours after they were dead using brains from a slaughterhouse.
Biological refuse, essentially.
Right. And they built this machine with pumps like a heart, filters like kidneys, an oxygenator like lungs, circulating this special fluid.
But the goal wasn't consciousness, right? It was about studying the brain's wiring.
Exactly. Not restoring awareness, but keeping the cells alive enough, minimally functional, to study the connectome, the intricate connections, in a way you just can't easily do otherwise.
But the ethical side of it, that seems like the huge difference compared to the 1940 film.
Massive difference. CESTAN's team made conscious ethical choices. Using slaughterhouse brains, not killing animals for the research, that shows a modern sensitivity right there.
And then that moment during the experiment, monitoring electrical activity.
Yeah, using a standard hospital monitor, they expected a reading of 0 dead tissue.
But they got
a score of 10, which is incredibly low, like a deep coma, definitely not consciousness, but it wasn't 0.
And CESTAN's reaction.
Immediate stop.
Yeah.
He's quoted saying something like, "Okay, forget it. Unplug the machine. Stop until we figure this out."
He didn't push it.
No. He paused everything the instant there was even a hint of minimal electrical activity resembling something found in a living brain. He called his colleagues, the NIH, the Yale bioethics director, Stephen Latham.
And the bioethicist agreed.
Completely. Latham said, if there is even a possibility of consciousness, yeah, you've got to stop the experiment.
That's such a stark contrast. In the 1940 film, the head reacting seems presented as a success. Here, even a tiny electrical blip triggers an immediate ethical halt.
It really highlights the shift. The modern researchers, even if legally okay, prioritize the ethical caution, avoiding any possibility of creating some minimal awareness over pushing the science right then. A completely different calibration of that science-ethics balance.
And this modern work also kind of revisits those questions about brain death from the 1940s skepticism.
It does. While maybe full conscious recovery after 15 minutes was unlikely then, Sustin's work and other research suggests the brain is maybe far more resilient than had been understood.
Cellular function might recover even after half an hour or more, especially with cooling.
Yeah, the potential seems greater than we used to think, which gives some retrospective plausibility to the technical possibility of keeping tissue viable in the 1940s, even if the revival shown was exaggerated.
So, okay, the 1940 film feels ancient, maybe dramatized. But the core scientific goals, keeping tissue alive ex vivo, pushing resuscitation limits, blurring life and death, and the ethical tangles they create, those are still absolutely current.
Totally. The online comments show people grappling with consciousness, suffering, and the price of progress, all sparked by those old, shocking visuals. Modern science, often less visually dramatic publicly, keeps provoking similar debates, just maybe more nuanced as technology lets us manipulate biology in more complex ways. That film is like a historical mirror, reflecting debates we're still having.
Wow, yeah. Looking at this 1940 film, Experiments in the Revival of Organisms, through all these lenses, public reaction, history, modern science, it really is quite a journey. You go from that raw gut sadness for the animals to maybe a kind of awe or just disbelief at the technical ambition back then. And then that really uncomfortable feeling that the foundations for some crucial modern medicine might have come from places and methods that, well, they challenge us today.
It absolutely forces you to face that ongoing tension, doesn't it, between wanting to know more, pushing boundaries, and the ethical lines we try to draw. And the sources show people have been arguing fiercely about where that line is for decades, whether it's online comments now or laws passed in the 60s and 70s.
And it's not over. As science keeps moving, preserving organs longer, fixing damaged tissues, exploring reanimation or brain viability, we have to keep asking the hard questions. What's the moral status of the stuff involved, animal or maybe even human tissue? And what cost, what suffering, what violation is acceptable for the potential payoff?
And perspectives change, right? What was acceptable, even celebrated in one era, can look barbaric later. What seemed like impossible sci-fi becomes routine. Thinking about the 1940 experiments alongside today's brain perfusion research just highlights that the ethical landscape of science isn't fixed. It's constantly being reshaped as our powers grow.
So next time you hear about some cutting-edge medical breakthrough, maybe life support, transplants, brain research, or you stumble across some challenging bit of science history online, maybe think back to this conversation. Think about all those different reactions: horror, admiration, pragmatism, and the ethical frameworks people use to try and make sense of it.
And maybe, just maybe, consider this. If scientific progress throughout history has often been built on work that pushed or even crossed the ethical lines of its own time, how will people in the future look back at the scientific practices we accept as normal, necessary, ethical right now? Okay, let's unpack this. Forget everything you think you know about the clear line between life and death for just a moment. Close your eyes and picture a scene that sounds like it's ripped straight from the pages of some dark, imaginative science fiction novel, or maybe a vintage horror film. You're in a dimly lit laboratory. The air is thick with the smell of disinfectant and something metallic. Strange machinery hums and clicks in the background, pumps, tubes, reservoirs of liquid. And there, on a stainless steel table connected to this humming contraption, sits, a severed dog's head.
It's an image that is, undeniably graphic and profoundly unsettling. Even today, knowing the history, it retains its power to shock and provoke.
It absolutely does. And here's the incredible and maybe slightly terrifying part. This wasn't a special effect. It wasn't fiction.
Yep.
This was a real historical moment captured on film in a 1940 Soviet documentary called Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. And that visual, you just imagine the dog's head seemingly disconnected from any body, its eyes flickering open, its ears twitching in response to sound, even, according to accounts, attempting to lick its nose. That is where our deep dive begins today.
Because that stark image, captured on grainy film almost a century ago, it forces us, really, to confront some of the most fundamental questions humanity has ever grappled with. What is life? What exactly is death? Where is that boundary between them? And, is it as firm and irreversible as we tend to believe?
Precisely. Our mission in this deep dive, guided by the sources you've shared with us, is to take this astonishing, controversial, historical event, these audacious early Soviet experiments, and use them as a lens to explore these enduring questions. We'll trace their unexpected and, in some ways, uncomfortable influence on modern medicine, and then connect all of it to cutting-edge research happening today.
And the complex ethical debates, too, right? About when life truly ends.
Exactly. It's a journey that spans from a 1940s Soviet lab bench to modern intensive care units and, deep philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness itself.
And it really compels us, I think, to think differently about the processes we consider to be the end of existence.
All right, let's step into that past then. This whole story revolves around that 1940s Soviet documentary film, Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. It was directed by David Yashin and documented the work being done by a scientist named Sergei Bryukhonenko at the Institute of Experimental Physiology and Therapy in Moscow.
Right, and what's particularly notable about this film, something the sources highlight, is that when it was released internationally, the English version actually featured an introduction by J.B.S. Haldane.
Haldane, the famous British geneticist.
The very same, a highly respected figure. Having someone of Haldane's scientific stature lending his name to the film, it certainly gave it a surprising level of scientific credibility, at least among some viewers back then. It suggested that the underlying scientific questions, even if the methods were shocking, were considered significant.
And central to Bryukhonenko's work, and really a key character in the film itself, was his invention, the autojector.
Ah, yes, the autojector. The sources describe this as a pioneering device, essentially the very first apparatus for cardiopulmonary bypass and what we would now call extracorporeal life support.
So basically the first heart-lung machine. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. Think of it as the crude ancestor of the sophisticated machines that support critical patients today. The sources describe it as being comprised of 2 diaphragm pumps and a kind of bubbling oxygenator within a reservoir. Its fundamental purpose was to take over the work of the heart and lungs.
So circulating blood outside the body, oxygenating it, pumping it back in.
Precisely. It was designed to sustain life functions mechanically when the body's own organs couldn't.
And the film set out to dramatically demonstrate the autojector's capabilities through a series of experiments on animals. Pretty graphic experiments.
Yes, quite. One segment, designed to show the machine's ability to keep tissues viable, depicted isolated organs functioning outside of the body. You actually see a dog's heart beating rhythmically in a tray, completely separated from the animal.
Wow.
And lungs artificially ventilated by bellows, clearly oxygenating blood being passed through them. It was a striking visual argument that the basic physiological mechanics of life could be maintained externally.
Right, illustrating the machine's ability to maintain those vital functions, respiration, circulation, independent of the whole intact organism.
But then, as you mentioned at the start, the film moves to the experiment that has burned itself into medical history and, frankly, popular imagination.
The severed head of a dog.
Yeah, connected solely to the autojector.
That's the image that defines this film for most people. The sources detail what was shown, this isolated head, its blood artificially circulated and oxygenated by the autojector, appearing to exhibit signs of life and responsiveness. Mm-hmm. The film shows it reacting to external stimuli, like a tap or a prod might cause an ear to twitch or an eye to blink.
And one source, Atlas Obscura, I think, mentions the unsettling detail of the head licking its nose when a weak acid solution was applied and reacting to sound.
Gosh, seeing just a head seemingly maintain some degree of integrated function, responding to the external world, is profoundly unsettling. It just forces you to question where life and consciousness actually reside.
And it immediately raises those fundamental philosophical questions, doesn't it? What is awareness?
Yeah.
Can consciousness or any form of subjective experience exist purely as brain activity, sustained by external means, without the rest of the body contributing?
Did the experiment answer that?
Well, no, not definitively, of course. And much of what was shown were likely reflexes or basic brainstem functions rather than conscious thought as we understand it. But it dramatically posed the question in a way that had rarely been seen before.
And the experiments went even further than that, right? The film also documented attempts at what they called full body revival.
Yes. It depicted an experiment where a dog was rendered clinically dead. Its blood drained, heartbeat and respiration stopped completely.
How long was it left like that?
One source specifies the dog was left in this state for about 10 minutes. Then the autojector was connected.
And the machine gradually returned oxygenated blood to the animal's body, essentially taking over the functions of the heart and lungs again.
And according to the film, the outcome was successful. The footage shows the dog's heart initially in a state of fibrillation, like chaotic twitching,
Right.
then returning to a normal sinus rhythm, followed by the resumption of spontaneous breathing.
But the claim was even bigger than just restarting the heart, wasn't it?
Oh, much bigger. The film makes the extraordinary claim that this dog, along with several others subjected to the same procedure, recovered fully over a period of about 10 days and went on to live healthy lives for years afterward, even, supposedly, siring puppies.
That claim of reversing clinical death and achieving full recovery, that must have been what truly pushed the boundaries of belief at the time.
Absolutely. When this film circulated internationally, it was screened in London in 1942, then in New York in 1943. It understandably created a sensation. The Time magazine account mentioned in the sources captures the audience's reaction, stating they felt the film might move many supposed biological impossibilities into the realm of the possible.
So it wasn't just seen as a scientific curiosity. Some people saw it as potentially redefining the limits of life itself.
Yeah, the reaction was this mix of fascination and awesome sort of morbid humor. George Bernard Shaw's response to the decapitation experiment is a famous example.
What did he say?
He joked about wishing his own head could be similarly sustained so he could focus purely on intellectual pursuits without the distractions of a body.
Huh. That's darkly witty. But it perfectly encapsulates the imaginative leap. The experiment represented this idea of mind potentially liberated, sustained purely by technology.
But alongside the astonishment and dark humor, there was, and absolutely still is, significant controversy surrounding these experiments and the film itself.
You mean whether it was even real?
Well, the sources point out that the legitimacy of the film has been questioned. There were suggestions, particularly highlighted in that Reddit thread you shared, that it might have been partly or entirely a propaganda hoax.
Propaganda. To do what?
Designed to project an image of Soviet scientific prowess, maybe intimidate other nations, given the geopolitical context of the late 1930s and early 1940s.
Okay, that makes sense as a motive, but was there any proof it was faked?
That's the thing. The sources also emphasize that no concrete evidence of actual fakery in the film has ever been definitively revealed. While the propaganda angle is certainly plausible as a motive for filming and distributing the work, the core scientific work by Bryukhonenko on artificial circulation and life support was real and documented elsewhere.
So the underlying techniques were real, even if the presentation was dramatic.
That seems likely. The film may have presented the results in the most dramatic, maybe even embellished light possible, but the experimental techniques themselves weren't entirely fabricated.
Still, even if the experiments were genuine in their execution, putting aside any potential propaganda stuff, the ethical implications today are, well, frankly, horrifying.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are unequivocal in stating that due to the blatant animal abuse and disregard for modern standards of medical ethics, recreating these experiments is just unthinkable.
The suffering involved, especially in the decapitation and those prolonged revival attempts, presumably without the kind of anesthetic or pain relief we demand today, it's deeply disturbing.
By any modern standard of animal welfare, yes. It's important to see these experiments not in isolation, but within a broader, often ethically challenging context of physiological research during that era.
Like what else was happening?
Well, as one of the Reddit comments points out, people like Vladimir Demikov were conducting similarly audacious and ethically fraught experiments. He was surgically joining the heads and forequarters of two dogs to create two-headed animals.
Two-headed dogs? Why?
He was aiming to advance transplant techniques. While different in goal from Bryukhonenko's revival work, both represent an era where the drive to understand and manipulate physiology sometimes seemed to completely override basic animal welfare and compassion.
That Reddit comment mentioning a two-headed dog living only 4 days, it really underscores the high cost to the animals involved in these extreme manipulations.
Exactly. So these revival experiments, while uniquely shocking in their depiction of a seemingly living severed head, were part of a wider, often brutal context of physiological research that pushed boundaries in ways we find totally unacceptable today.
Which brings us to a truly surprising turn, doesn't it? from that deeply unsettling autojector machine and those controversial experiments in the 1940s.
Yeah, there's a clear, if sometimes uncomfortable, conceptual legacy that flows directly into modern medical technology.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. You look at that clunky, primitive autojector from the film, and it seems like a relic of a bygone age, something from a museum.
Right.
But the PubMed source, in its title alone, calls it the first apparatus for cardiopulmonary bypass and extracorporeal life support. That's a direct link, isn't it, to technology that saves lives every single day now?
Yes, that's the key insight here. Well, the context and the ethics were drastically different. Bryukhonenko's autojector established a fundamental principle. The principle of supporting circulation and oxygenation outside the body using a mechanical system. The sources explicitly state that the autojector laid the conceptual groundwork and is similar in function to modern extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machines, or ECMO.
ECMO machines. They are absolutely vital in modern intensive care units, aren't they? They're used to support the lungs and sometimes the heart when a patient's own organs are failing, giving them a chance to recover.
Exactly.
So that device designed to revive the dead dog is, in principle, the ancestor of machines that keep critically ill people alive today. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Precisely. And the comparison isn't just to ECMO. The basic system of pumping and oxygenating blood externally is also conceptually similar to the systems used for renal dialysis, which filters blood for patients with kidney failure.
Right. Dialysis too. These are standard life-sustaining technologies that we almost take for granted today, and they owe a conceptual debt to those early, frankly horrific experiments.
It's quite remarkable, a machine born from ethically questionable experiments aimed at something seemingly impossible. Like reviving the dead becomes the foundational concept for technology that regularly pulls people back from the brink of death today.
And the historical impact extends even further into surgery.
Yes. The sources note that Bryukhonenko's work, specifically his research into sustaining circulation with the autojector concept, was instrumental in the development of early cardiac surgery. He collaborated with a surgeon named Nikolai Terabinsky, who used the autojector concept in experimental open-heart procedures on animals from 1929 through the 1940s.
Open-heart experiments back then.
Yeah. This work on bypassing the heart and lungs during surgery was a critical step towards enabling the complex heart valve operations and other cardiac surgeries performed routinely today.
That's an incredible legacy, laying the groundwork for open-heart surgery. It forces a complex perspective, doesn't it? Acknowledging the immense scientific contribution while still grappling with the horrific context of the animal suffering involved.
Absolutely. And despite the ethical shadow, the scientific significance of Bryukhonenko's pioneering work was eventually recognized. He was posthumously awarded the prestigious Lenin Prize in 1958.
It underscores that challenging duality, recognizing groundbreaking scientific achievement that arose from methods we now find abhorrent. Okay, let's pivot then. From the technology and the history to the deeper philosophical questions that these experiments threw into such stark relief. Using the Soviet revival experiments, especially that unsettling image of the dog's head, as our starting point, we can really delve into the fundamental debates about the nature of life, death, and maybe consciousness itself.
This is where that Feldman source on the philosophy of death becomes incredibly useful. It highlights just how complex defining death really is, not just for practical purposes like legal or medical criteria.
Which we'll get to.
Right. But from a purely philosophical standpoint, philosophers are engaged in what's called conceptual analysis, trying to understand the fundamental nature of what death is, not just how we recognize it in practice.
So asking, what does it mean for something to be dead? And the Feldman source looks at some historical attempts, right? Like the traditional idea, tracing back to Plato, that death is a separation of the soul from the body.
Which, as the source points out, runs into immediate problems in a modern context. I mean, if you're a materialist and don't believe in a soul as a separate thing, that definition is a non-starter.
Okay.
But even if you do accept the concept of a soul, does this apply to all life? Do plants have souls? Do single-celled organisms have souls? Plants and bacteria definitely die, but the soul definition seems way too narrow to cover all biological death.
Right, makes sense. Okay, so if it's not about the soul, maybe it's simpler. Maybe death is just the cessation of life. That's definition D1 in the Feldman source. And it seems, well, intuitively correct. Something is alive, then its life stops. Therefore, it's dead.
It seems straightforward, yeah. But the Feldman source then introduces the philosophical challenge posed by suspended animation.
Suspended animation, like freezing people.
Or even simpler things. Think about organisms, or even parts of organisms, like seeds, bacterial spores, or human cells, sperm, eggs, embryos that can be frozen or dried out. Their metabolic processes, the functions we associate with life, can be brought to a virtual standstill. According to that simple cessation of life definition, D1, these organisms would technically be dead while in that suspended state.
But the crucial point is, they can be revived. You can add water to the seed, thaw the embryo. Their life can be restarted later, so they weren't permanently gone.
Exactly, which leads to a refined definition, D3 in Feldman. Death is the permanent cessation of life. This definition seems to handle the suspended animation problem much better.
Okay, permanent cessation. If it can be revived, the cessation wasn't permanent, so it wasn't truly dead. That sounds logical.
But here's where the philosophical paradox really bites, according to Feldman. Imagine two identical organisms are put into suspended animation at the same moment, in exactly the same physical state. Let's say one will be successfully revived in the future, but unknown to us now, the other never will be. Maybe its storage container gets accidentally destroyed years later.
Okay.
According to that D3 definition, permanent cessation, during the entire period they were both suspended, the organism that would eventually be revived wasn't dead. But the organism that wouldn't be revived, it was already dead from the moment it was suspended.
Even though they were physically identical at that time.
Exactly. Physically identical. The definition D3 makes their state of being dead or not dead at a particular moment dependent entirely on future events.
That feels wrong somehow.
It clashes strongly with our intuition, right? That whether something is alive or dead should be determined by its intrinsic properties at that moment, not by what might happen to it hours, days, or years down the line.
Wow. So the philosophical insight here is that even something as fundamental as defining death, when you push it with scenarios like suspended animation or potential future revival, becomes incredibly complex. The traditional definitions struggle.
Yeah, and perhaps no simple, intuitive analysis of what death is clearly correct when faced with these edge cases. Which brings us back to the Soviet experiments.
Right, especially the severed dog's head sustained by the autojector. It adds another layer of complexity, specifically regarding consciousness. That head was shown reacting to stimuli. Makes you wonder, was there any consciousness there? Any form of subjective experience or awareness, however minimal?
And the Reddit thread included that comment from a Penn State psychiatrist who made a crucial point.
Yeah.
Our perception of consciousness isn't just brain activity in isolation. It relies heavily on the intricate feedback loops and contributions from all the body's organs and senses.
How so?
They send chemicals and signals to the brain, constantly shaping our mental state. Removing the head eliminates this massive network of interaction. The body is constantly talking to the brain.
Which suggests that consciousness is perhaps not just located in the brain tissue itself, but is maybe an emergent property of the complex dynamic system of the entire organism.
That's a strong argument. Take away most of the system, and even if the brain tissue is supplied with oxygen and nutrients, you've lost the vast majority of the inputs and outputs that constitute our normal conscious experience.
So the brain tissue might remain viable, capable of basic reflexes maybe, but the integrated conscious experience we know requires the body as a whole.
Precisely. That's the argument. However, another comment in that same thread raises a counterpoint, kind of speculatively.
Which is?
Whether it might theoretically be possible, with sufficiently advanced technology in the future, to mimic all those missing bodily signals and inputs artificially.
Back to the machine. It takes us right back to the autojector concept, just way more advanced. If consciousness is purely a function of electrochemical signals, could a future machine replicate all the necessary bodily signals to sustain something akin to consciousness in an isolated brain?
The 1940s experiments certainly didn't prove it, not even close. But they dramatically posed the question in the most visceral way possible.
And it immediately turns introspective for you, the listener, doesn't it? What does this imply about your own consciousness? How deeply is it tied to your physical form, your heart, lungs, gut, senses? Could some aspect of you potentially exist or experience things if separated and sustained purely by technology?
It also forces us to revisit that boundary between life and non-life. If Bryukhonenko's team could take an organism to what looked like death, no heartbeat, no breath, blood drained, and then bring it back to apparent full recovery using a machine.
Did it truly cross the line into being irrevocably dead in the first place? Or was it merely in a state of profound physiological arrest that science, for the first time, had just found a way to reverse?
These experiments fundamentally challenge the idea of death as a single, sharp, irreversible moment. They suggest perhaps that death might be more of a process, a fading gradient.
Or that states previously considered terminal could, given the right external support, be temporary pauses rather than final endings.
And these incredibly complex philosophical questions about what life and death truly are and where the boundaries lie, they aren't just historical curiosities or abstract philosophical debates. Not at all.
No, they resonate powerfully in modern medicine and research today, especially in areas like critical care and neurology.
They absolutely do. One of the most direct modern parallels where these questions manifest is the ongoing and often contentious debate surrounding the definition of brain death. The NPR source provides an excellent look at this current controversy.
Right, brain death. In the United States, the standard legal definition for death in the context of irreversible brain injury comes from the Uniform Determination of Death Act, or UDDA. That was established back in the 1980s.
And it defines death as the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem.
All functions of the entire brain. That phrase seems key.
It is. That's where the core of the modern debate, according to NPR, lies. Critics argue that current medical testing protocols used to declare brain death might not truly assess all functions of the entire brain.
Like which functions might be missed.
Specifically, parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus. It controls crucial bodily functions, temperature, hormone regulation, growth. Critics suggest the hypothalamus might potentially retain some minimal function even after a patient has been declared brain dead based on standard tests of brainstem reflexes and electrical activity.
And this discrepancy between the strict legal standard and potentially detectable residual brain function is fueling significant controversy.
Exactly. Critics point to cases like Jahi McMath, a teenager declared brain dead in California back in 2013. Her family disputed the diagnosis, kept her on mechanical ventilation, and she received care for years.
I remember that case.
The NPR source quotes Dr. D. Alan Schumann, a neurologist who argues that Jahi's subsequent physical development, she reportedly went through puberty while on life support, is inconsistent with a state of irreversible cessation of all brain function, particularly hypothalamic activity.
He's quoted saying he's never heard of a corpse that underwent puberty before. That's a powerful statement.
It is. For critics like Schumann, this suggests current tests may miss some functions, meaning the patient isn't truly dead by the UDDA's strict definition.
So on one side, you have experts like Dr. David Greer and Dr. Robert Truog, who are also quoted in the NPR piece. What's their perspective?
They argue that while some minimal cellular activity might persist somewhere, current, properly performed brain death testing is sufficient. They believe it accurately determines the point of irreversible loss of consciousness and the integrated brain function necessary to sustain life.
They're confident in the current tests.
They state emphatically that there has never, ever been a case of a person correctly diagnosed as brain dead where that person has recovered any degree of consciousness or the brainstem function required for spontaneous breathing. For this view, the current tests accurately reflect the irreversible loss that constitutes brain death.
But on the other side are figures like bioethicists Thaddeus Pope and Daniel Solmesy and Dr. Schumann, who emphasize that all functions of the entire brain language in the law.
Right. They argue if any part, like the hypothalamus, retains any function, then according to the strict legal definition, the person isn't dead yet. Solmesy suggests current testing might produce false positives against that legal standard and calls for more comprehensive tests.
Where do medical bodies stand?
Well, the American College of Physicians supports the whole brain standard, but has also stated concerns about overly narrow testing criteria, potentially not fully capturing the legal requirement. So there's debate even within the establishment.
And the stakes in this debate are huge, aren't they? Not just philosophically about when a person is truly gone, but practically.
Immense. As the NPR source highlights, the criteria for brain death are directly tied to organ donation protocols. If the definition or the required tests were to change, potentially fewer people would meet the criteria for legal death while on life support.
Which could have a significant impact on the availability of organs for transplantation.
Exactly. Potentially worsening the already critical shortage. So the unsettling questions raised by that 1940s image of a seemingly responsive severed head.
Questions about what constitutes life, what brain activity means for personhood, the permanence of cessation.
They are absolutely central to intense medical and ethical debates happening right now in hospitals and policy forums.
And the exploration of life's boundaries continues even at a cellular level, doesn't it? Even hours after death has been declared by current standards. That 2022 retina study you shared is a fascinating example.
Yes. This study, published in Nature, looked at postmortem retinas. from mice and, significantly, from human donors who have been declared dead, either from brain death or cardiac death.
And what did they find?
The remarkable finding was that researchers were able to revive certain functions in these retinas hours after they were obtained.
Revive function? You mean bring back sight?
No, not sight or consciousness, of course. The retina is just one part of the visual system. But they were able to restore key cellular activity. By providing oxygen and nutrients to the donated retinas in a specialized setup, they managed to get the photoreceptor cells, the rods and cones that detect light, to respond to stimuli. And even more remarkably, they managed to restore electrical signaling between retinal neurons, like the cells were talking to each other again.
So essentially, they revived light sensing and signal transmitting function at the cellular level in tissue that had been removed from a body declared dead.
That's right. It's a powerful demonstration that death, at least from a cellular perspective, across all tissues, isn't necessarily an instantaneous switch off. Different cells and tissues might retain viability or the potential for function for periods after the cessation of integrated whole body systems, provided they receive the right support.
It pushes our understanding of the transition from life to death down to the microcellular level. It's not just one moment.
Exactly. Which brings us inevitably to the ethics.
Yes. Moving from the science and philosophy, we have to directly confront the ethical dimension woven throughout this whole history. The Soviet experiments, while scientifically pioneering in concept, are just ethically indefensible by modern standards.
The sources are unequivocal on that. The 1940s Soviet experiments involved extreme animal suffering that is simply unacceptable today. The deliberate decapitation, the attempts at full-body revival after clinical death without modern anesthetic or pain management, it demonstrates a profound disregard for animal welfare.
This blatant animal abuse is a primary reason these specific experiments could never and should never be replicated.
Absolutely. And this difficult history connects to a broader, grim reality mentioned in the Reddit thread about historical human and animal experimentation conducted under horrific circumstances.
The thread references atrocities like the experiments conducted by Unit 731 in Japan during World War II.
And also deeply unethical U.S. experimentation on vulnerable populations, including Black Americans, institutionalized individuals, prisoners, and even infants, often without consent, without anesthesia, without regard for suffering.
It's a very dark part of medical history.
It is, and it's crucial to report what the sources say about it impartially. Some sources suggest or claim that certain medical advances did emerge from practices like Unit 731.
But that's disputed.
Oh, strongly disputed. Other parts of the Reddit thread and other historical analyses argue that the data obtained was often sloppy, flawed, and gathered through pure brutality and cruelty, with little actual scientific benefit derived.
So, regardless of the debate over the value of the data, the methods were atrocious.
Unquestionably. The sources emphasize the immense suffering, the complete violation of human rights, and the profound ethical breaches involved in these historical cases.
It forces us to confront that uncomfortable question, raised explicitly in one Reddit comment and implicitly in the broader discussion. At what horrible cost would such scientific progress be worth it?
Is there any potential knowledge or advancement that could possibly justify methods involving extreme suffering, violation of autonomy, or a fundamental disregard for life and dignity? It's a heavy question.
Modern ethical frameworks, thankfully, have evolved significantly to prevent such abuses, haven't they?
Yes. We now have rigorous processes like informed consent for human subjects, institutional review boards, IRBs, that scrutinize research proposals, and strict guidelines for animal welfare in research.
That retina study source, for example, it mentioned the ethical approvals and procedures for obtaining human tissue donations, including consent and anonymization,
highlighting the stark difference from historical practices. These modern protocols reflect a collective understanding that the pursuit of knowledge cannot come at any cost.
And the ongoing debate around brain death criteria, that's also fundamentally an ethical one, right? Wrestling with definitions of personhood, the limits of medical intervention, the rights and dignity of patients and their families at the very end of life.
Exactly. These discussions demonstrate how far we've come in establishing ethical standards, but also how the fundamental questions about the value of life, the definition of death, and the ethical limits of our pursuit of knowledge continue to challenge us and evolve.
Okay, so let's try and bring this deep dive together. We began with that shocking, almost cinematic image from a 1940s Soviet film, a severed dog's head, seemingly kept alive by a machine. An image that captures the audacious and, yes, Ethically fraught, early attempts to mechanically sustain life outside the body.
And we've traced how that pioneering, if disturbing, work laid crucial conceptual groundwork for life-saving modern technologies like ECMO, and even contributed directly to the development of cardiac surgery.
It's a complex legacy, isn't it? Scientific innovation born from methods we now find completely abhorrent.
Definitely complex. We've seen how these historical experiments dramatically illuminate fundamental philosophical questions about what constitutes life, consciousness, and death, questions that remain deeply challenging today.
And these questions aren't just abstract. They inform ongoing medical and legal debates about brain death criteria and push the boundaries of our understanding, even down to cutting-edge cellular research into postmortem function, like that retina study.
It seems that despite significant scientific and technological advancements since the era of the autojector, death remains, in many profound ways, mysterious.
Mysterious not necessarily in an unknowable supernatural sense, perhaps.
No, but mysterious in how it continues to evade simple definition, how it blurs the lines we attempt to draw, and how it forces us to confront fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and our relationship with our physical form.
It feels like the more we learn about the mechanics of life, the more nuanced and complex our understanding of its cessation becomes. It's not just an on-off switch.
Bryukhonenko's work with this device, crude as it looks, was genuinely pioneering for the time. Well, the sources point out that his research directly contributed to developing techniques that actually made the first heart valve operations possible later on.
Wow, okay, that's a direct link to major surgeries.
A direct link. And the autojector concept itself is fundamentally similar to modern life support machines we still use, like ECMO, that's extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, and also the machines used for renal dialysis, cleaning the blood when kidneys fail.
So even though the imagery in the film is, frankly, pretty shocking, the underlying tech concept wasn't just some weird dead end. It had a real, tangible impact on medical history.
Precisely. It wasn't just theoretical lab stuff. And one source even mentions that a version of Bryukhonenko's actual autojector is still on display today at the Museum of Cardiovascular Surgery in Moscow. It's a real historical artifact.
That's fascinating. So keeping that real-world medical connection in mind is important because, as you said, what the film depicts next really pushes the boundaries of belief for a lot of people watching it today.
It absolutely does. So let's walk through the key experiments as the film presents them, based purely on what the sources describe being in the film. It starts relatively simply. Well, simply in context.
Right, context is everything here.
It begins with isolated organs. The idea is to set the premise that parts of an organism can be kept alive artificially outside the body.
Okay, building the case.
Exactly. So the film shows a canine heart, a dog's heart, just sitting in a tray, apparently beating, with 4 tubes attached to it, clearly disconnected from anybody.
Just beating in a tray, okay.
Yeah. Then there's this quite disturbing visual of a lung, also in a tray, being mechanically inflated and deflated with bellows.
Like an accordion.
Sort of, yeah. And it's apparently oxygenating blood that's passing through it in the process. It's really setting you up, preparing you for this idea that life functions can be maintained piece by piece mechanically.
Okay, groundwork laid. Then what?
And then we get to the segment that is, without a doubt, the most infamous.
Yeah.
The one that really defines the film in popular memory and sparks the strongest, most visceral reactions online. We're talking about the severed head.
Yes, the severed dog head. The sources describe the sequence pretty vividly, don't they?
They do. You see what is presented as a freshly severed dog's head. It's placed on a table.
Just on the table.
On the table. Hooked up via tubes to the autojector, which is supposedly circulating oxygenated blood through its vessels, keeping it, well, viable in some sense.
Okay. And then the film tries to show it's still functional.
That's the claim. The film proceeds to show the head apparently responding to external stimuli, supposedly demonstrating restored function, maybe even some level of consciousness.
What kind of stimuli? What does it supposedly do?
The sources list quite a few. There's a spotlight shown in the eyes, and the film shows the pupils constricting, reacting to the light.
Okay.
They show like a piece of candy or something sweet being placed in the mouth, and the head appears to accept it and even swallow it.
Swallowing? Wow.
Yeah. Then they apply citric acid to its snout.
Why citric acid?
Presumably as an irritant, something to provoke a reaction. And the head reportedly licks its snout clean afterwards.
That's specific.
Very. Then they put some other irritant in the eyes, and tears appear to form. And finally, they strike a hammer nearby, like on the table, and the head supposedly reacts to the loud sound.
It reacts how? Like flinches.
The descriptions vary, but yeah, some kind of startle response is implied or shown. And the sources specifically note that the film keeps cutting back to the head during this sequence, really emphasizing its presence and its apparent responsiveness.
It sounds incredibly unsettling, just visually and conceptually.
Deeply unsettling. And it's worth bringing up that detail. Someone noticed in the comments online again that observation about the label on the citric acid bottle.
Right, the English label.
Yeah, someone pointed out it looked suspiciously like it was in English, not Russian, and even suggested it might look, digitally altered within the film footage itself. It's tiny detail, but for people looking for signs of staging.
It's a big red flag.
Exactly. It fuels those later interpretations we'll get into.
Okay. So after the isolated organs and the severed head, where does the film go next?
Well, it escalates dramatically. It moves to its most ambitious claim.
Yeah.
The revival of a whole dog from clinical death.
This is presented as the big finale, the proof of concept.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The culmination of all the experiments. The film shows a living dog. Some sources identify it as a German shepherd being deliberately brought to a state of clinical death.
How do they do that?
By draining its blood completely, causing cardiac arrest.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And the sources mention it was left in this state, clinically dead, for a period, reportedly up to 10 minutes in some accounts or sequences shown.
10 minutes without blood flow to the brain.
Okay. Then the dog is connected to the autojector. The film shows the process, the machine returning the blood back into the animal's circulatory system.
Then what happens then, according to the film?
According to the film, after a few minutes, the dog's heart is shown fibrillating, quivering ineffectively.
Right.
Then gradually resuming a normal, steady rhythm. Respiration, breathing, supposedly resumed shortly after that. And then they disconnect the machine.
And the dog just gets up.
The film makes a truly extraordinary claim here. It asserts that this dog not only recovered completely, but lived a full, healthy life for several years afterwards.
For years?
For years. One source even notes the film claims it went on to father offspring. It's presented, quite literally, as a triumph over death itself, a complete reversal.
Wow, that is a huge claim, a dramatic narrative, as you said. So this wasn't just shown in Soviet labs. How did the rest of the world react when they saw this, particularly scientists?
That's a really important part of the story. It wasn't kept entirely secret. The film was shown to scientists internationally. It was screened in London in late 1942.
During the war?
During the war, yes.
Yeah.
And perhaps more significantly, it was shown to a large audience, reportedly 1,000 U.S. scientists, in New York City in 1943. This was at the Congress of American-Soviet Friendship.
1,000 U.S. scientists saw this. What was their reaction?
According to a Time magazine report from that period, the reaction from that New York audience was pretty striking. They felt it might move many supposed biological impossibilities into the realm of the possible.
So it genuinely impressed them, made them think differently.
It sounds like it. It suggests that prominent scientists of the era saw it and thought, wow, maybe things we thought were impossible aren't. It expanded their view of what science could potentially achieve.
That's powerful. Any other notable reactions from the time?
Well, there's a great quote from the famous playwright George Bernard Shaw. Upon hearing about Bryukhonenko's experiments, he reportedly quipped that he was even tempted to have my own head cut off so that I can continue to dictate plays and books without being bothered by illness.
That's darkly humorous, but definitely telling. He saw the potential, or at least the fascinating implication.
Exactly. But not everyone was convinced it was suitable for, let's say, general consumption.
Understandably.
The Canadian Medical Association Journal reviewed the film much later, in 1959. They described it technically as well photographed and well arranged, and noted it held interest throughout, which is interesting praise.
What?
But they firmly concluded it was inappropriate for the general public. They drew a line there.
That caution makes a lot of sense given what you've described. It sounds incredibly graphic.
It is. And yet, despite the controversy and the, deeply unsettling visuals, it's worth noting that some film historians appreciate its construction. Elisa Nostradano, writing for the Russian Film Archive, Gosfilmofond, praised the film's production quality. She stated that even the shocking scenes were shot with evident care and attention to detail.
So technically well made, even if disturbing. And what about Bryukhonenko himself? Was his work ultimately recognized?
It was, officially at least. His overall scientific contributions, which perhaps encompassed more than just what's sensationally depicted in this specific film, were recognized posthumously with the prestigious Lenin Prize.
The Lenin Prize. Okay, so high state honor.
Yes. So we have this really fascinating historical object, right? A film presented as documentary science, rooted in actual pioneering medical technology.
Shown internationally, made waves.
Exactly. Impressed scientists got Shaw joking about decapitation, but also deemed too disturbing for the public. Now, fast forward to today. How are people reacting to it now, decades later, often finding it randomly on the internet?
Right, that's the core of our dive today. Looking at this huge volume and, frankly, the variety of online responses, it seems like they tend to fall into roughly 4 main categories, though, as you said, there can be overlap.
Definitely overlap. But these 4 give us a good framework. The first group, let's call them the believers. These are the viewers who largely see the film as documentation of a genuine scientific milestone. Maybe early, maybe crude, but groundbreaking nonetheless.
Okay, so they take it more or less at face value as a scientific achievement?
Pretty much. Their core perspective is focused on the technical feat itself and its clear implications for medical progress down the line. They tend to accept that there was a significant degree of success, even if maybe not exactly as portrayed in every detail.
What kind of things do they say? What's the language they use?
You see comments from this group really emphasizing the pioneering nature of the work, especially considering the time it was done, the technological limitations back then.
Right, context matters.
Exactly. You see phrases like, this video wasn't made yesterday. They barely understood that shit back then. It's that kind of appreciation for the historical context. They focus on the success, like keeping the organs going or keeping the head alive.
So they see it as proof of concept.
Yeah, arguing it's not meaningless.
Yeah.
Because look, the scientists figured out all of the pieces needed to keep the brain going artificially, even if just for a while.
Any specific examples you found?
Oh yeah. We saw comments calling the film amazingly interesting, and the experiments themselves pioneering. Some viewers explicitly state they see it as an enormous boon to the medical society.
Connecting it to modern medicine.
Directly. Recognizing the line from this early, maybe shocking work to things like modern life support machines, heart, and other organ transplants. One person we saw commented that they actually found the film while specifically researching the history of transplant surgery.
Ah, so for them, it fits right into that historical narrative of progress.
Exactly. This perspective really highlights that aha moment for people who maybe didn't realize the deep and sometimes unsettling history behind technologies we now kind of take for granted.
Like bypass machines or dialysis?
Right. It shows how those basic principles have these foundational experiments behind them, even experiments that look really disturbing to us today. It grounds modern medicine in this, challenging past.
Okay, so that's the believer perspective. Now moving to a viewpoint that's almost the polar opposite. Our second category, the skeptics.
Right. This group looks at the film's really dramatic claims and visuals, and they just don't buy it. They question the authenticity, suggesting it was staged or exaggerated, or maybe even outright faked for effect.
So their core view is doubt, mistrust of what's being shown.
Yeah, deep doubt. They tend to believe the film is likely a recreation of experiments, or perhaps a heavily staged presentation. Maybe created more for, say, propaganda purposes, or just to sensationalize the research, rather than being a strictly accurate, real-time scientific record.
You hear phrases like,
Things like, unfortunately, things aren't always as they seem. That captures the underlying sentiment. They question the methods, they question the results claimed, often speculating about, camera tricks, special effects, manipulation.
and this isn't just a general feeling, right? The sources mention specific reasons for this skepticism.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just vague distrust of old footage. The most compelling points cited in the sources come from these apparent discrepancies between what the film claims and other accounts, or just modern scientific understanding.
Like what are the big discrepancies?
Okay, number 1, the severed head. Some sources cite scientists who claim to have actually seen the real experiments back then, and they reported that the severed dog head only survived for a few minutes when hooked up to the autoinjector.
A few minutes, not the hours implied or suggested by the film's sequences?
Exactly. That's a direct contradiction.
No.
A few minutes versus prolonged function or responsiveness is a huge difference.
Okay, that's a big one. What else?
The revival of the whole dog. This is maybe even bigger. The film claims, dramatically, that the dog fully recovered, lived for years, even had puppies.
Right, the miracle recovery.
But sources state that, according to the actual records from Bryukhonenko's institute, the dogs revived using this method only survived for a few days afterwards, not years.
A few days versus years. Okay, that's a massive gulf between the film's story and the supposed records.
It completely undermines the film's triumphant narrative, if true. And then there's the modern scientific perspective. Skeptics point to the claim of full recovery after 10 minutes of clinical death from blood loss.
Yeah, I flagged that earlier. 10 minutes is a long time without oxygen to the brain.
Exactly. Sources point out that our modern understanding of neurology suggests the animal should have suffered serious brain damage after that long. The film certainly doesn't show a brain-damaged dog. It shows a supposedly healthy, recovered one.
So the science itself makes the claim questionable.
For many viewers today, yes. And the skepticism even extends to the filmmaking techniques used. Remember that citric acid label?
The English one that looked maybe edited.
Right, that feeds directly into the idea of staging or manipulation. Another critique mentioned in the sources is about the camera angle used for the severed head scene.
What about the angle?
Some suggest it's filmed specifically from an angle where nobody can tell whether it's severed or just a dog in the cupboard below, implying maybe it was a trick, like a live dog's head just poking through a hole in the table.
Okay, like a magic trick setup.
Kind of, yeah. And skeptics also point to what they see as technical impossibilities in the movements shown. Some sources argue that the jerking or the reactions shown in the severed head sequence,
Like licking its snout.
yeah, or reacting to the sound. They argue those movements would be impossible without the neck muscles attached to the torso and spinal bones, suggesting these weren't purely responses from an isolated head kept alive by blood flow alone.
Implying there was more to it than just the head and the machine.
Right. Maybe some remaining nerve connections, or maybe it wasn't fully severed, or maybe it was faked entirely. And then there's the propaganda angle.
Ah, yes. Haldane's sympathies and the Soviet context.
Exactly. Some sources explicitly link the film to potential Soviet propaganda, suggesting it might have been exaggerated specifically to showcase the perceived superiority of Soviet violence during a very politically charged time. Haldane's known communist leanings are sometimes brought up to support this view.
Any specific people who outright call it fake?
Yeah, author Ken Smith, who studies historical films and oddities, is mentioned in our sources as someone who believes the film is basically fake.
Okay, so this whole skepticism category really resonates today, doesn't it? It feels very modern.
It really does. It mirrors how we're constantly encouraged to approach media critically now. Be skeptical, look for evidence, consider the source. It's a potent reminder to question extraordinary claims, especially with historical footage, and to think about the motives behind how scientific information gets presented.
Definitely. Okay, moving on to a category driven less by science or skepticism and more by, well, gut reaction and ethics, the ethical critics.
Yeah, for these viewers, the debates about whether it was real or faked or what it meant for science often take a back seat. Their primary reaction is one of profound distress and anger about how the animals were treated.
So the animal cruelty aspect is paramount for them.
Absolutely. Their core view is that the experiments, as shown in the film, regardless of outcome or authenticity, constitute inhumane and unethical animal cruelty, period.
And the language they use reflects that strongly.
Oh, incredibly strongly. The language in the comments we saw is often powerful, visceral. It reflects deep sadness, horror, disgust, all directed at the apparent suffering inflicted on these dogs.
What kind of phrases come up?
Things like, my heart broke for that poor dog, or just simply, poor guy. And direct condemnations like animal cruelty. Viewers describe the film as indescribably sad, horrible. This is the most horrible thing I've seen today, cruel thing to do to an animal. Many express being just plain disgusted.
There's a real focus on the animal's experience, their potential suffering.
Exactly. This group voices significant concern for the animal's sentience. Their ability to feel, to experience things, their capacity to feel pain and fear is central. One comment specifically mentioned how miserable the German Shepherd in the revival sequence looked.
And pointed out they're intelligent animals.
Right, highlighting that dogs are damn intelligent and sensitive animals, attributing emotional depth and capacity for suffering to the subjects themselves. And you see direct statements just calling the work flat out unethical and inhumane.
Does this connect to broader philosophical debates?
It often does. The discussion in this category frequently touches on those bigger questions about animal consciousness and suffering. Commenters sometimes reference broader arguments, sources outside the film itself. Someone even brought up the philosopher Jeremy Bentham and his famous question about animals. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?
So the film really prompts viewers to confront these fundamental ethical questions about our moral obligations to other species.
Definitely. And the ethical critiques are also frequently framed by making comparisons, explicit comparisons, to other instances of animal testing, both historical and modern. The sources mention comparisons to things like modern drug testing practices that use rats or monkeys, which is still obviously a huge ethical debate today, or historical practices like medical school dog labs or rabbit labs, where animals were used for surgical practice, sometimes sedated but ultimately killed.
So placing it within a known history of animal use in science.
Yes, but perhaps the most striking comparisons, the ones that really show how profoundly disturbing the film is for this group, are the ones some viewers make to infamous historical human experiments.
Human experiments? Like which ones?
The sources cite viewers referencing things like the horrific experiments conducted by Japan's Unit 731 on Chinese prisoners during WWII, where people were treated literally as disposable logs, or historical U.S. medical experiments conducted on marginalized groups Black individuals sometimes operated on without proper anesthesia, experiments on asylum patients, prisoners, even newborns, who were wrongly believed for a time not to feel pain.
Wow. So they're drawing parallels between this dog experiment film and some of the darkest chapters of human medical ethics history.
Exactly. The fact that viewers make that leap, that they invoke things like Unit 731 to articulate their ethical revulsion at the dog experiments, speaks volumes about the level of perceived suffering and the deep sense of wrongness the film evokes in them.
It suggests the horror kind of transcends species for them in this context.
It really does. It highlights how, for some, the instrumentalization of a living being for experimental purposes touches this universal nerve of horror. It also underscores how much our ethical standards have evolved and how complex it is to judge historical actions through today's lens.
Are there any key phrases that sum up this ethical critique?
Yeah, phrases like, "No scientific gain is free," and "the emotional cost is often paid by the voiceless." That really captures the sentiment. There's also this questioning of human arrogance, the idea that we think we have the right to inflict these kinds of procedures on animals just for our own survival or curiosity.
So for them, it's not science,
It's seen as a record of profound suffering, and they feel strongly that animal torture isn't a circus freak show. It shouldn't be treated lightly, gawked at, or certainly not celebrated.
This category really lays bare that fundamental tension we still grapple with today. Science versus ethics, progress versus compassion, especially regarding animals.
Absolutely. The film becomes this historical flashpoint that ignites passionate debate about where we draw those lines, how we balance potential benefits against inflicted harm, and how much our values around animal welfare really have shifted over the decades.
Okay, so believers, skeptics, ethical critics.
What's the fourth category?
Our final category approaches the film from a pretty different angle altogether. They're less focused on the science, the ethics, or even the reality of it, and more interested in its unique, bizarre, or unsettling quality as a piece of media, as a cultural artifact. We're calling these the cult admirers.
Cult admirers, so they like it, but in a weird way. Kind of, yeah. Their appreciation often stems from the film's just sheer strangeness. It's surreal, macabre, or a very distinct vintage aesthetic. They tend to view it through the lens of, like, weird history or historical horror, or maybe even a kind of Cold War science fiction movie that happens to be real or presented as real.
So the focus is on the weirdness, the unsettling vibe.
Exactly. The strangeness, the unsettling power, its unique place in these niche historical or cultural contexts. That's what draws them in.
What kind of language do they use to describe it?
You see it described with phrases like a macabre masterpiece or cinema gold or even a proto-Frankenstein propaganda piece. That last one acknowledges the potential propaganda angle but still appreciates its artistic or cult value.
So the imagery itself is compelling to them.
Yeah, the imagery of undead dogs and surreal machines is seen as just compellingly bizarre. These viewers often explicitly frame the film as Cold War era sci-fi or horror or simply weird history. They might appreciate its vintage aesthetic or just find it fascinatingly creepy.
It fits into that oddities corner of the internet.
Perfectly. It slots right into interests captured by terms like cult of weird or found on websites like damn interesting.
Mm-hmm.
For them, it's not necessarily being viewed as pure scientific documentation, but more as this incredibly strange, fascinating product of its specific time and place.
Does this group make connections to other things, like pop culture?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a big part of this perspective. Viewers draw parallels to movies, things like Mars Attacks, with the disembodied heads, or the B movie, The Thing with Two Heads. Mm-hmm. They might reference concepts from horror films like Reanimator's Short Tie, invoking movies about reanimating dead bodies.
So it resonates with existing horror and sci-fi tropes for them.
Exactly. And it's also noted that the film's imagery and subject matter have actually influenced or been referenced in other media like music and videos.
Really? Like what?
The Metallica video for their song All Nightmare Long is mentioned in sources as containing similar themes or visuals, the kind of gritty, experimental, unsettling vibe. And apparently there's even a song by the artist Lemon Demon that was originally titled Experiments in the Revival, a direct nod to the film.
Wow. Okay, so it's entered that sort of cultural consciousness.
It seems so. This category really views the film primarily as this powerful, unsettling cultural artifact. Yeah. It shows how something presented as science, especially when it's boundary-pushing, visually arresting, and taps into these primal fears about death, life, reanimation, can kind of bleed over into art, entertainment, and fuel this specific kind of morbid fascination that goes way beyond its original purpose as a scientific report.
Okay, so those are the four lenses: believers, skeptics, ethical critics, and cult admirers. Looking across all of them, what are the big recurring themes? What does this all reveal?
Well, when you synthesize these four quite distinct categories of reaction, several powerful recurring themes really jump out. And they reveal a lot, I think, about how we process complex, disturbing information, especially when science, ethics, and media all collide like this.
What's the biggest one?
I'd say the most overriding theme is that inherent science-ethics tension that the film just forces you to confront. It really puts you face to face with that fundamental conflict between the drive to pursue knowledge, the potential for medical advancement, and the ethical cost of that pursuit, especially when that cost involves inflicting harm on living beings.
You see that directly in the comments, right? The debate about whether it was worth it.
Exactly. Those comments, debating whether the experiments were ultimately pointless animal torture versus an enormous boon to medicine, are a direct expression of that tension. People are actively trying to weigh the value of the claimed outcome against the perceived suffering. And this isn't just some abstract historical debate about this one film. It's really a microcosm of the ongoing societal discussions we have now about the ethics of research, technology, and progress in general.
That makes sense. What's another major theme?
The crucial role of media in interpreting science is huge here. The film itself, remember, produced and presented as a documentary back in 1940, was the original medium. It shaped those initial scientific and public perceptions. It framed that narrative of success and possibility.
But now,
decades later, you have platforms like the internet acting as these massive decentralized spaces for reinterpretation. Anyone can watch it, pause it, zoom in, scrutinize details like that citric acid label, compare the film's claims against historical records they can look up, or against modern scientific knowledge. They can share their gut emotional reactions, their cultural associations. This whole process of questioning the film's staging, its authenticity, its potential as propaganda, it's a fascinating example of how modern viewers critically engage with scientific media, especially media from a different time with different rules of presentation.
we don't just passively accept it anymore.
Not at all. And then there's the philosophical side. The infamous severed head experiment, particularly, pushes viewers to grapple with really fundamental questions about defining life, death, and consciousness.
Yeah, what does alive even mean in that context?
Exactly. What does it mean for just a part of an organism to be alive or responsive when it's disconnected from the whole? Does any of that observed activity actually constitute consciousness? Mm-hmm. And as we saw reflected in the some comments, this even sparks discussions about deeper concepts, like the idea of a soul. Does an animal have one? Does a human? What's the difference? These are questions science itself often struggles to answer definitively, but the film's imagery undeniably provokes them.
It taps into some very deep human anxieties and curiosities about what life is.
It really does. The idea of maintaining some form of life or awareness outside the body is classic science fiction fodder, but seeing it presented in what looks like a real historical experiment makes those questions feel much more immediate and, frankly, unsettling.
And you also mentioned the clash between past and present viewpoints.
Yes, the reactions vividly illustrate that tension between historical context and modern sensibilities. Viewers today are watching this 1940 film through the lens of over 80 years of subsequent scientific advancement and also through significantly shifted ethical standards.
So our knowledge has changed how we see it.
Definitely. Our modern understanding of, say, how critical oxygen is for brain cells makes that claim of a full recovery after 10 minutes of clinical death seems scientifically implausible, or at least highly questionable to many viewers.
And our ethics have changed too.
Massively.
Oh.
Our evolved ethical standards regarding animal rights and welfare mean that the treatment of the dogs shown is viewed with far greater condemnation today than it might have been within the scientific community back in 1940. Although even then, remember that Canadian Journal review from '59 showed there was caution about showing it publicly.
Right. It wasn't universally accepted even then.
No. And those comparisons people draw now to horrific historical human experiments, like Unit 731. They really emphasize that while ethical perspectives are definitely relative to time and culture to some extent, the sheer horror of using living beings in such extreme ways seems to touch upon a more universal, enduring sense of revulsion that kind of transcends specific eras. It forces us to think about how we judge the past, while also acknowledging how far, or maybe how little, we've actually come in some areas.
So ultimately, why does this old film still pack such a punch? What's the so what factor?
I think the sheer variety and the intensity of the reactions really highlight that so what factor. Why does a grainy 80-year-old Soviet film still generate such passionate debate, such fascination, such disgust? It's because it taps into some of our most fundamental human questions, fears, and fascinations.
Like conquering death.
Exactly. It confronts us with that deep-seated, perhaps primal desire to conquer death, to push the very boundaries of what's possible through science and technology. It forces us to look closely at our relationship with other living beings, the non-human world, and consider the moral responsibilities that come with scientific power.
And the fear of science going too far.
And the fear of scientific hubris, absolutely. The potential for that relentless pursuit of knowledge to maybe go too far, to override essential ethical considerations in the process. The film serves as a historical flashpoint for all those anxieties.
So it's more than just an old movie.
Much more. It's a historical artifact, yes, but it also functions as this potent Rorschach test. How you react to it says a lot about your own values, your skepticism towards media, your stance in that ongoing, often really uncomfortable debate about the limits and responsibilities of science.
So wrapping this up, we've seen how just one single, pretty controversial piece of historical scientific media can evoke such incredibly varied, passionate responses even today. And these responses reflect really deep-seated questions that we, as a society, are clearly still grappling with.
Yeah, questions about what's possible scientifically, what's ethical, morally, and frankly, how we even begin to process information that challenges our understanding of the world, our values, and our place in it.
Yeah.
We're starting with those bold, sometimes pretty graphic experiments from nearly a century ago, and following that thread all the way to the sophisticated, often life-saving technologies used in modern hospitals today, like ECMO.
Exactly. It's quite a journey.
And we won't stop there. We'll even touch upon the furthest speculative frontiers of preservation, where the very definition of life and death gets pushed to its absolute limits.
Which raises some huge questions, obviously.
Definitely. We've dug through, quite a stack of sources for this journey. We have historical accounts detailing those early medical experiments, scientific journals laying out the nuts and bolts of modern technologies like extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, that's ECMO, and extracorporeal cardiopulmonary resuscitation, ECPR.
The clinical side.
We also have a really thought-provoking legal analysis looking specifically at cryopreservation, and finally a discussion that grounds all of this technology in the deeply human experience of navigating serious illness.
It's important to bring that human element in, yeah.
So our mission today, to understand the fundamental scientific principles that connect these efforts across time. How did the early kind of raw attempts at artificial circulation and oxygenation evolve?
Right. What were the stepping stones?
We want to see how the technology itself has shifted, moving from purely mechanical, sometimes jarring approaches towards more integrated, biologically supportive life systems. We'll explore how these practices challenge and interact with our conventional understanding of life and death, as seen especially in the legal landscape.
That legal part is fascinating.
And crucially, we need to consider the very real human experience that always sits right alongside these incredible technical advancements. You'll see how modern tools like ECMO and even concepts related to cryopreservation echo the core ideas behind Bryukhonenko's autojector, albeit with vastly different outcomes and implications.
What's fascinating here is truly seeing how those initial bold, almost audacious ideas from people like Bryukhonenko, despite their relatively crude execution and, limited success by today's standards, undeniably laid down foundational concepts. They sparked a line of thinking about external life support that was absolutely necessary to eventually lead to modern cardiac surgery and advanced critical care technologies. It wasn't a simple, smooth path from point A to point B.
Right.
You know?
No, definitely not linear.
But you can absolutely draw a clear conceptual line from those early mechanical pumps and biological oxygenators to the complex circuits used to support patients today.
Absolutely, that connection is key. And that conceptual line starts right back with SS Bryukhonenko and his machine, the autojector.
Yeah.
Let's really dive into section 1, the dawn of artificial life support the autojector era.
Okay.
So tell us more about SS Bryukhonenko. What was his background, and what was the driving force behind his work on the autojector?
Well, Bryukhonenko was a physiologist and researcher operating in Russia. The sources point to a really powerful motivation stemming from the horrifying experience of witnessing the mass casualties during World War I.
Ah, okay.
That kind of widespread trauma fueled a desperate need to find practical ways to deal with severe blood loss during surgery, particularly in battlefield conditions, and to develop methods for maintaining circulation and oxygenation when a body's own systems had failed or were severely compromised.
And he wasn't working alone on this ambitious project, was he?
No, he had a crucial collaborator, S. Chechelin. They had actually been working on developing this apparatus, the autojector, together since at least 1926. Their shared goal was, quite audacious for the time, to create a machine that could effectively take over the function of both the heart and the lungs simultaneously.
Okay, let's get a picture of this machine. What was the design of the autojector actually like? It sounds like something out of early science fiction.
It really does. By modern standards, it was certainly rudimentary, but the underlying concept was revolutionary. It had two primary functional parts. First, there were two mechanical diaphragm pumps. Think of these as the artificial heart. They provided the necessary pumping action to circulate blood throughout the system.
Right.
Second, and this is the part that often strikes people today as, quite stark, it utilized the rhythmically ventilated lungs of an animal.
Animal lungs.
Yeah. These biological lungs served as the oxygenators. They were responsible for adding oxygen to the blood and removing carbon dioxide before it was returned to the circulation.
So you had mechanical pumps handling the circulation and actual biological lungs handling the gas exchange. That's a really striking combination of machine and biology.
Precisely. It was a design born out of the limitations of the available technology and the biological understanding of that era. They needed a way to oxygenate the blood effectively, and using animal lungs seemed at the time like a plausible, if ultimately limited, solution.
These experiments are perhaps most famously known because they were captured in a film, right?
Yes, the 1940 Soviet film titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms. This film included some truly dramatic demonstrations, most notably showing the reanimation of a severed dog's head, which was depicted as being able to react to stimuli like sound or light.
Wow.
It's a really powerful and, for many, quite unsettling piece of scientific history.
But there's a really important caveat about that film that's often overlooked, isn't there? There's been suspicion about how accurately it represents the results.
Absolutely, and the sources are clear on this. The film is widely suspected to be, at least in part, a restaging of the procedures done for dramatic effect. Some of the aspects that might have revealed scientific limitations weren't always shown in full, continuous shots.
Ah, okay. Selective editing, perhaps?
Possibly. However, it's crucial to understand that the experiments themselves were real and were thoroughly documented in detailed scientific records and publications by Bryukhonenko and his team.
Right.
The film also made bold claims, suggesting that dogs who had been drained of blood and then revived using the autojector went on to live for years afterward.
Years? Really?
Well, that's what the film suggested. The laboratory records provide a much more nuanced picture. While the dogs were revived and circulation respiration was restored, they survived only for days after the experiment, not years as the film implied.
Okay, that's a huge difference.
It is. And, perhaps most critically, the records documented that the animals suffered serious brain damage. This detail is often lost when people focus solely on the dramatic and visually impactful moments of the film. The immediate revival was achievable, but achieving long-term neurologically intact survival was simply not possible with the technology of that era.
That distinction is incredibly important. It completely changes the narrative from a miracle story to a demonstration of a proof of concept, but one with severe limitations on the functional outcome, especially concerning the brain.
Exactly.
It really highlights the challenge of brain perfusion, which is central to what comes next.
It absolutely does. And while Bryukhonenko's work was pioneering in the context of whole-body artificial support, he wasn't working from scratch, There's a longer history of researchers thinking about bypassing the heart and lungs.
Right. Section 1.3 goes into these conceptual predecessors and earlier perfusion efforts. This wasn't the first time people had conceived of supporting organs artificially.
Not at all. The sources mentioned a period roughly from 1667 up through 1935 as the genesis of these fundamental concepts, acknowledging centuries of freethinkers and researchers who explored similar ideas before Bryukhonenko. However, a key difference was that many of these earlier pioneers focused their efforts on perfusing single organs in isolation, rather than attempting to support the entire circulatory system of a living being.
And why that focus on just one organ at a time? Was it just easier?
Primarily due to the significant limitations in the capacity and sophistication of their equipment. Trying to effectively perfuse and oxygenate the blood needed for the entire body's circulatory system was simply beyond the technical capabilities of early machines.
Right, makes sense.
Single organs, like a kidney or maybe a limb, tolerated this kind of temporary bypass for longer periods, making those experiments more feasible and yielding more stable results, relatively speaking.
So they could potentially keep, say, a kidney alive outside the body for a bit, but the major problem remained how to sustain the entire organism, particularly the brain.
Exactly. This was the critical, persistent problem. How do you perfuse the brain effectively in the absence of the heart's normal, powerful pumping action? Brain hypoxia, a lack of oxygen to the brain, leads to rapid, severe neurological damage or irreversible death within minutes. Overcoming this hurdle was the major challenge that early attempts at total body bypass constantly faced.
Did anyone specifically try to tackle brain perfusion before the development of the full heart-lung machine?
Yes, the sources highlight the work of Lawrence Frederick O'Shaughnessy, a surgeon working in London. In 1939, just before his tragic death, he published experiments where he specifically focused on perfusing the isolated brains of cats and dogs.
Isolated brains. Wow.
Yeah. He used a mixture of Ringer lactate solution and blood for this, circulating a volume equivalent to about 5% of the patient's estimated blood volume.
That sounds like a very targeted approach to solving that specific critical brain oxygenation challenge.
It was. And O'Shaughnessy himself demonstrated remarkable foresight. He concluded his publication, which speculated on the future of cardiac surgery, with a message that is truly visionary for its time. He wrote, and I'll quote from the sources here, "This method of cerebral perfusion is clearly unfitted for immediate clinical application, but it is presented as an example of the sort of work necessary for the further advance of the surgery of the heart."
Powerful perspective.
Absolutely. He clearly saw his work not as a ready-to-use treatment, but as foundational research paving the way for future medical breakthroughs.
Seeing the incremental steps needed, even if the immediate application isn't there, that's real science.
Tragically, as the sources note, his early death in May 1940, at the young age of 40, was described as a serious blow to the development of cardiac surgery. He was killed during an air raid in Flanders.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah, his pioneering work and his vision for the future were cut short.
So this really raises an important question, doesn't it? How do you bridge that gap?
Which gap specifically?
The gap from perfusing an isolated organ or achieving that kind of limited, damaging whole body support like Bryukhonenko's to reliably sustaining brain function and the entire organism for the hours required for complex surgery, or even the days and weeks needed for critical care today.
Right. That immense gap was bridged by significant technological leaps that built on these early, sometimes difficult lessons. It wasn't one person or one machine, but a series of crucial developments.
And that bridge brings us squarely to Section 2. Bridging to modern cardiology, the heart-lung machine. This is where we start to see the transition from intriguing but limited experiments to technology that fundamentally changed medical practice.
Exactly. The invention of a reliable heart-lung machine was the key.
The central figure here, widely credited with inventing the first practical heart-lung machine, is John Haysham Gibbon.
That's correct. Gibbon was an American surgeon. Like Bryukhonenko, his initial drive came from a difficult clinical situation that highlighted a desperate need for better tools.
What happened?
He was looking after a patient who tragically died from a massive pulmonary embolism following surgery. This experience led him to focus intensely on developing a machine that could take over the function of both the lungs and the heart, allowing oxygenated blood to continue flowing to the body while the natural organs recovered or were repaired.
So his initial thinking was primarily about bypassing the lungs, which then expanded to include the heart.
Exactly. His research began in earnest at the University of Pennsylvania. He started with experiments on cats, carefully refining his prototype heart-lung machine. By 1937, he was able to publish results showing that he could keep these animals alive for hours using his device.
Hours, okay. That's progress.
Significant progress.
Oh,
And he
yeah.
continued this work, notably with his assistant, Mary, who later became his wife and a vital collaborator.
And this painstaking work culminated in the first truly successful human use in 1953.
Yes, a landmark achievement that truly ushered in the era of open heart surgery. In 1953, Dr. Gibbon successfully used his heart-lung machine to operate on an 18-year-old woman. She needed closure of an atrial septal defect, which is essentially a hole in the wall between the upper chambers of her heart. The procedure utilized cardiopulmonary bypass with his machine. Heparin, an anticoagulant, was used a critical element to prevent the blood from clotting within the artificial circuit.
You need that.
Absolutely. And the surgery was successful. The patient recovered.
That success must have been an incredible moment. It fundamentally proved the concept was viable and laid the groundwork for all the open heart surgery that followed.
It absolutely did. It demonstrated conclusively that it was possible to reliably and safely take over the functions of the heart and lungs in a human patient for the duration required to perform complex procedures. However, the path forward wasn't without significant challenge.
Oh.
The sources mention that the 4 subsequent patients he operated on using the machine did not survive.
Oh, no.
Yeah. This incredibly difficult period led him to make the decision to temporarily step away from cardiac surgery.
That must have been devastating after such a breakthrough. It speaks to how difficult and precarious this technology was initially.
Immeasurably so. But the core concept was proven. Other researchers and institutions picked up the torch. The Mayo organization, specifically John Kirkland and his associates, took the fundamental design of the Gibbon-type machine and made significant improvements, enhancing its reliability and paving the way for its more widespread adoption.
And then came Walton Lillehay with some other important innovations.
Yes, Walton Lillehay also made pivotal contributions in the mid-1950s. In 1954, he introduced a technique he called controlled cross-circulation.
Controlled cross-circulation, what's that?
This was a very striking method where a patient, usually a child requiring complex heart surgery, was connected directly to a biological donor, most often a parent.
Wait, connected to their parent?
Yes. The donor's healthy heart and lungs literally served as the pump and oxygenator for the patient during the procedure.
Wow, using another person's living body as the bypass machine. That highlights the urgent need and creativity of the time, even if it sounds medically and ethically incredibly complex from a modern perspective.
It certainly was a bold, resource-intensive, and ultimately limited approach born out of the immediate need for a solution. It underscored the limitations of the mechanical pumps available at that very moment.
Right.
But very quickly, the field moved forward. In 1955, Dr. Lillehay introduced the bubble oxygenator. This device was far simpler and easier to use than previous oxygenators, making open heart surgery much more widely practicable and accessible for surgical teams around the world, moving away from the necessity of a live donor.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If we look back at Bryukhonenko's autojector and compare it directly to Gibbon and Lillehay's work on the heart-lung machine, there's a fundamental conceptual difference in what they achieved, despite both dealing with artificial circulation and oxygenation.
Absolutely. This is the conceptual shift that the sources highlight. While the idea of supporting the circulation artificially had been explored for centuries, most of the earlier pioneers, including some of Bryukhonenko's predecessors, focused on perfusing only single organs.
Right.
Gibbon and Lillehay, building on those foundations and learning from the challenges of whole-body support, achieved something different. They successfully implemented reliable artificial support for the entire body for the durations necessary for surgical repair. They truly overcame the critical, long-standing challenge of effectively perfusing and protecting the brain for extended periods, which was the major limitation of earlier total body attempts like Bryukhonenko's, resulting in the observed brain damage.
So Bryukhonenko was attempting whole body support primarily for revival after what would be considered death or severe injury today, but the outcomes were limited and severe brain damage was a major consequence.
Pretty much, yes.
Gibbon and Lillehay achieved whole body support, but for a carefully controlled period during surgery and crucially with the goal and ability of maintaining functional brain status.
Exactly. The focus evolved. It shifted from the dramatic, often unsuccessful attempt to restart a system that had completely failed, as in Bryukhonenko's revival experiments, to the more sophisticated, controlled method of temporarily replacing the function of the heart and lungs in a living patient. This allowed complex medical interventions to take place with the explicit goal of enabling the subsequent recovery of the patient's native organ function and preserving neurological integrity. It was a move from attempts at crude mechanical revival to a biologically integrated life support system that enabled true healing and recovery in complex cases.
And this evolution eventually leads us directly to the technology that is arguably the modern embodiment of the autojector's core function, providing extracorporeal support for failing heart and lungs. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or ECMO.
That's the direct descendant, yes.
Moving into section 3. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, ECMO, the modern autojector. So, if the heart-lung machine was primarily for enabling surgery, how is ECMO different, and what exactly is it?
Right, good question. ECMO, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, is best understood as a highly advanced form of temporary life support. It's crucial to grasp that it is a supportive therapy, not a cure for an underlying disease.
Okay, supportive, not curative.
Exactly. Its fundamental purpose is to provide temporary gas exchange, adding oxygen to the blood, and removing carbon dioxide and our circulatory support for a patient whose own heart and lungs are failing so severely they cannot sustain life on their own. It achieves this by circulating the patient's blood through an external circuit that performs these vital functions.
How widely is this technology used in modern medicine? Is it common?
It's become a critical tool in intensive care globally. According to the Extracorporeal Life Support Organization, or ALSO registry, ECMO has been used on over 150,000 patients through 2020, encompassing neonates, children, and adults.
Wow, 150,000.
Yeah, and the growth in its availability and use has been dramatic. The number of centers offering ECMO expanding from just 83 in 1990 to 492 by 2020.
Huge expansion. And the type of ECMO used depends on whether it's the lungs, the heart, or both that need support.
Precisely. There are two basic configurations. Veno-venous, or VV ECMO, is used specifically when the primary problem is severe respiratory failure, but the heart is still pumping adequately. It provides respiratory support only.
Okay.
Veno-arterial, or VA ECMO, is used when there is failure of both the respiratory and cardiac systems, such as in severe cardiogenic shock or cardiac arrest refractory to standard treatments. VA ECMO bypasses both the heart and lungs, providing both oxygenation CO2 removal and circulatory support. It's the choice when the heart can't pump effectively.
Okay, let's break down how the circuit works. It sounds incredibly complex, connecting a patient to this external machine.
Well, the basic principle is relatively straightforward conceptually. Blood is drained from the patient's body, pumped through an artificial lung, the oxygenator, which adds oxygen and removes carbon dioxide, and then warmed and returned to the body.
So like an external set of lungs and maybe heart too?
Essentially, yes. The key difference between the two types lies in how the circuit is connected to the patient's blood vessels, and therefore how blood flows relative to the heart and lungs.
How are those connections made?
In VV ECMO, the circuit is connected in series with the patient's heart and lungs. Blood is drained from the venous side, like a large vein, oxygenated outside the body, and returned back into the venous side.
Okay.
This means the oxygenated blood still needs to be pumped by the patient's own heart through their lungs, which might be very sick, but still allowing some flow to reach the rest of the body.
Right.
In VA ECMO, the circuit is connected in parallel with the heart and lungs. Blood is drained from the venous side, oxygenated, and then pumped back into the arterial side of the circulation, completely bypassing the native heart and lungs. This provides both oxygenation and direct circulatory flow to the body.
Bypassing them entirely. And where exactly are the tubes, the cannulas, placed in the patient?
Cannulation strategies are crucial and vary based on the ECMO type and patient factors. For VV ECMO, you might use a single venous cannula, typically placed in a large vein like the right internal jugular vein in the neck.
In the neck. Okay.
This has advantages like access, potentially allowing for some patient movement, but can have drawbacks like sensitivity to positioning and the risk of recirculation where the oxygenated blood returning is accidentally pulled back into the drainage line instead of circulating to the body.
That doesn't sound good.
No. Precise single cannula placement often requires guidance using ultrasound or transesophageal echocardiography, which is an ultrasound probe inserted into the esophagus to get detailed views of the heart and major vessels from behind it.
Okay.
Alternatively, a double venous cannula approach uses two separate cannulas, often one in the femoral vein in the leg for drainage and another in the jugular or opposite femoral vein for return. This configuration generally minimizes recirculation risk. There are also different flow directions like femoroatrial or femoral-femoral.
Right. And for VA ECMO?
For VA ECMO, cannulation can be either peripheral or central. Peripheral cannulation usually involves draining from a large femoral vein in the groin and returning blood into a major peripheral artery, like the femoral artery in the groin, the axillary artery in the armpit, or the carotid artery in the neck.
Carotid artery too. Wow.
Yes. Central cannulation involves surgically accessing the chest, draining blood from the right atrium, a chamber of the heart, and returning it directly into the ascending aorta, the main artery leaving the heart. This is often preferred in patients who have just had heart surgery and already have their chest open, as existing cannulas can be used.
I've heard about a risk of the leg losing circulation with peripheral VA ECMO, especially when using the femoral artery. Is that a common issue?
Yes, it's a significant concern. The large arterial cannula needed in the femoral artery for VA ECMO can sometimes block or severely restrict native blood flow down that leg.
Right.
To prevent devastating limb ischemia, lack of oxygen to the leg tissue, a smaller second cannula, called a distal perfusion cannula, is often inserted further down the leg, for example, into the posterior tibial artery at the ankle. This ensures blood flow reaches the extremity distal to the main cannula.
Ah, a backup line for the leg.
Essentially, yes. If femoral access isn't suitable due to, say, severe peripheral artery disease or prior surgery, accessing the axillary or carotid artery might be necessary alternatives.
So VA ECMO isn't just providing oxygen like the autoinjector intended. It's literally taking over the pumping function of the heart as well.
It is. It provides both gas exchange and full hemodynamic support, essentially acting as both an artificial lung and an artificial heart. This makes it an indispensable tool for patients experiencing severe failure of both organs.
Which brings us to section 3.3, clinical applications, including extracorporeal cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or ECPR. What kind of conditions indicate the need for VA ECMO?
Well, VA ECMO is indicated for a range of critical cardiac conditions that lead to dangerously low cardiac output and hypotension, even after using maximal conventional treatments like powerful medications or devices like an intra-aortic balloon pump.
Okay.
This includes various causes of cardiogenic shock, such as severe acute coronary syndromes, that's heart attacks, refractory arrhythmias, those heart rhythm problems that won't stop, cardiac depression from sepsis, inflammation of the heart muscle, myocarditis, massive pulmonary embolism, drug toxicity affecting the heart, and critically decompensated heart failure.
So really severe situations.
And the most severe. It's also used preventively during certain high-risk cardiac procedures for patients who can't be weaned from conventional bypass after surgery, for primary graft failure after a heart or lung transplant, and crucially, as a bridge to more durable solutions like a long-term ventricular assist device, VAD, or a heart transplant itself.
A bridge to transplant. Got it. And ECPR. How does ECMO fit into resuscitating someone from cardiac arrest?
ECPR is the specific application of VA ECMO as a rescue therapy during cardiopulmonary resuscitation in patients who have ongoing cardiac arrest and are not responding to standard ACLS protocols.
When CPR isn't enough.
Exactly. It's typically performed in highly specialized centers because it requires immediate availability of a large, expert, multidisciplinary team. We're talking cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, critical care physicians, neurologists, specialized nurses, perfusionists who operate and manage the ECMO circuit, and respiratory therapists.
A whole army.
Pretty much. The goal of ECPR is to rapidly restore continuous blood flow and oxygen delivery to the vital organs, especially the brain, while the medical team simultaneously works to diagnose and treat the underlying cause of the cardiac arrest.
Are there particular types of cardiac arrest where ECPR has shown the most promise?
Yes, specifically in expert tertiary centers with established protocols. A prime example is the Minnesota Resuscitation Consortium, or MRC. They developed a protocol for patients experiencing refractory out-of-hospital cardiac arrest due to ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia chaotic or extremely rapid heart rhythms that don't respond to defibrillation.
Okay, specific rhythms.
Right. Their protocol involves rapid transport of these patients with ongoing mechanical CPR to the hospital, often directly to the cardiac catheterization lab, where ECPR is initiated immediately. Once on ECMO, they proceed with coronary angiography to look for blocked arteries and perform angioplasty if needed. This kind of highly protocolized approach in SWEC patients has been associated with significantly improved survival and, importantly, improved neurological outcomes compared to relying solely on conventional CPR for extended periods.
And I understand there's even a frontier where ECMO initiation is being attempted outside the traditional tertiary care setting, mobile ECMO.
That's the concept of mobile ECPR, yeah. It's an effort to decentralize the initial phase of VA ECMO, bringing a highly specialized team and equipment closer to the patient. This might mean initiating ECMO in a smaller local emergency department, or even in some cutting-edge systems at the scene or en route during transport, followed by rapid transport to the main resuscitation hub, the tertiary center.
What's the thinking behind taking such complex technology mobile? Seems incredibly challenging.
The primary goal is to drastically minimize the amount of time the patient is solely reliant on conventional chest compressions for perfusion. Even excellent manual or mechanical CPR provides significantly less blood flow to the vital organs compared to ECMO.
Right, it's just not the same.
Not even close. The odds of achieving a favorable neurological outcome decline very rapidly with prolonged periods of low blood flow during resuscitation. Mobile eCPR aims to establish robust, continuous blood flow via the ECMO circuit much sooner, potentially preserving critical organ function, especially the brain, until the patient can reach the definitive treatment center where the underlying cause of arrest can be addressed. It represents a kind of hub-and-spoke system where the specialized team is the mobile component.
This entire process, from cannulation to ongoing support, sounds incredibly demanding and requires constant vigilance.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Section 3.4 really highlights the significant challenges and the intensive multidisciplinary nature of ECMO management. The cannulation itself is a high-stakes procedure requiring preparation of the access sites, often the femoral areas in the groin, sometimes while mechanical chest compressions are still ongoing.
While CPR is happening.
Sometimes, yes. It requires a coordinated team effort involving surgeons, intensivists, cardiologists, and emergency physicians working together. Once the cannulas are in place, their position needs to be checked daily, as even subtle displacement can lead to serious issues like poor flow or injury.
What are the most common medical challenges once a patient is on ECMO? You mentioned risks.
Complications are unfortunately frequent and can be severe. Bleeding is a major concern, both directly at the access site where the large cannulas are inserted and systemically throughout the body.
Why systemically?
Because patients on ECMO require systemic anticoagulation, usually with heparin, to prevent the blood from clotting within the artificial circuit, which would stop the machine. However, the foreign surfaces of the circuit itself activate and consume the body's natural clotting factors and can activate the fibrinolytic system, which breaks down clots, inherently increasing the risk of bleeding. Sources report a significant incidence of major bleeding complications, often in the range of 5–10%, including spontaneous bleeding in the gastrointestinal tract, accumulation of blood in the chest cavity, hemothorax, and tragically, bleeding within the brain. Intracranial hemorrhage.
So you're constantly in a difficult balancing act, trying to prevent clots in the machine while avoiding causing serious bleeding in the patient.
Precisely. It's a very tightrope walk that requires continuous monitoring and fine-tuning. Management involves frequent assessment of the patient's coagulation status using specific blood tests like activated clotting time, ACT, PTT, and anti-Zexi levels, and then tightly adjusting the heparin dose based on those results.
Tricky.
Very. If anticoagulation is too low, the circuit can clot off. If it's too high, the patient can bleed.
What else needs constant monitoring on the machine itself?
Monitoring the ECMO circuit flow is critical. A sudden decrease in flow can be an early warning sign of several problems, including internal bleeding, leading to less blood available to drain cardiac tamponade, where a blood or fluid accumulates in the sac around the heart and compresses it, or a problem specific to VA ECMO called left ventricular LV distension.
LV distension.
Yeah. With VA ECMO, the machine is bumping blood forward into the arteries, creating high pressure. If the native left ventricle of the heart is too weak to pump effectively against this high pressure, blood can back up into the LV, causing it to overfill and distend. Managing LV distension is crucial because it can impair myocardial recovery and lead to pulmonary edema. It often requires strategies like inserting an intra-aortic balloon pump, which helps the native heart pump, or a more advanced device like an Impella, which actively pulls blood out of the ventricle, or in severe cases, even performing a procedure called an atrial septostomy to create a small opening between the heart chambers to decompress the LV.
Complex interventions just to manage the support itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even though the lungs aren't doing the gas exchange on ECMO, you still have to manage them.
That seems counterintuitive.
Yes, absolutely, especially on VA ECMO. Even though the blood flow is bypassing them for gas exchange, the lungs are still in the circuit, so to speak. They need protective ventilation strategies using low tidal volumes and respiratory rates on the mechanical ventilator, and often positive end expiratory pressure, PEEP, to keep the small air sacs open.
Okay.
This helps prevent further lung injury and pulmonary edema, which can be worsened by VA ECMO flow. Temperature management is also standard practice, using a heat exchanger in the circuit to control body temperature. Often, therapeutic hypothermia, cooling the patient to 33–36 degrees Celsius for the first 24 hours, is targeted after cardiac arrest to help protect the brain, followed by gradual rewarming.
And that distal perfusion cannula you mentioned for the leg.
Preventing limb ischemia with peripheral VA ECMO is a non-negotiable management point. Ensuring adequate blood flow to the limb where the arterial cannula is placed is vital to avoid losing the leg.
Got it.
Post-cardiac arrest patients on ECMO also typically undergo urgent diagnostic procedures, such as cardiac catheterization to identify and treat the cause of the arrest if it's cardiac, and imaging like CT scans of the head, chest, abdomen, and pelvis to assess for complications like bleeding or brain injury. Echocardiography is also essential for assessing the function of the native heart and identifying sources of problems like LV distension.
It really reinforces the need for that extensive, constantly available multidisciplinary team you mentioned earlier.
It's incredibly resource-intensive 247 critical care. The overarching goal is to stabilize the patient, provide full support, and buy precious time for their native heart and lungs to recover from the underlying insult.
Which brings us to the crucial stage for many patients, weaning from ECMO, section 3.5. How does that delicate process work? When do you know it's time?
Weaning is a careful, stepwise process designed to assess whether the patient's own respiratory and/or cardiac function has recovered sufficiently to take over the work that the ECMO machine has been doing. For VV ECMO, where it's just lung support, weaning involves gradually reducing the gas flow, often called the sweep gas, through the oxygenator. This decreases the amount of carbon dioxide removed by the machine and reduces the amount of oxygen transferred. Lung recovery is often slower than cardiac recovery and can take 1 through 3 weeks. Signs of recovery include the patient's arterial oxygen saturation, SA2, increasing relative to the mixed venous saturation, SVO2, which reflects oxygen delivery to the tissues, and general improvement in SA2 for a given level of machine support. Improvements are also often seen on chest x-rays and measures of lung compliance.
So you're looking for objective signs of lung improvement.
Exactly. Weaning proceeds when the patient can maintain adequate gas exchange on very low ECMO support settings, minimal FiO2, oxygen concentration, low gas flow rates, and the ventilator can provide some support.
And for VA ECMO, where the machine is also supporting the heart, how does that work?
VA ECMO weaning can be considered once the underlying etiology of the cardiac failure has been addressed and there are objective signs that the native heart function is recovering.
What kind of signs?
These signs include improvements in the heart's filling pressures, an increase in native blood pressure that might even require decreasing or stopping blood pressure medications and starting vasodilators. The return of pulsatility in the arterial pressure waveform the machine provides continuous flow, but a recovering heart starts adding pulses.
Interesting.
And changes in blood oxygenation measured from different sites, like a decreasing PO2 from a right radial arterial line, which indicates more native cardiac output pumping blood through the lungs.
How do you actually test that native heart function while they're still connected to the powerful ECMO machine? Seems tricky.
It is. During VA weaning, the clinical team will gradually decrease the ECMO circuit flows. This is typically done in small increments, perhaps 1-2 liters per minute at a time, down to a very low standby flow rate, maybe 0.5 to 1.0 liters per minute.
Okay, reducing the support slowly.
Right. Changes are also made to the mechanical ventilator settings and the oxygen levels being delivered. At these very low flows, it's also important to increase systemic heparin slightly to prevent clotting in the circuit. Transesophageal echocardiography, DEE, is frequently used during this weaning process to get real-time images and directly assess how well the native heart is now pumping blood forward against the minimal resistance from the low-flow ECMO circuit.
Using echo to see the heart working again. Is there a set duration for how long someone stays on ECMO before attempting to wean? Like a standard time?
No, there's no hard and fast rule. The decision to wean is based purely on the patient's physiological recovery, not a calendar date. Typically, patients are on support for maybe 3-4 days, but it could be significantly shorter or longer depending on the underlying condition and response.
Right.
Attempting to take a patient off ECMO too early is extremely risky and can lead to immediate cardiovascular collapse. On the other hand, unnecessarily prolonging ECMO support when recovery isn't happening just increases the risks of complications and morbidity without providing further benefit.
Makes sense.
If a patient's heart function, often measured by ejection fraction via echo, remains very poor after a couple of days of support, it might signal that weaning is unlikely to be successful without considering alternative strategies.
So what happens in those cases where a patient can't be successfully weaned off ECMO? What are the options?
For patients who are neurologically intact but whose heart or lungs simply haven't recovered sufficiently, they might be candidates for more durable forms of mechanical support, such as a long-term ventricular assist device, VED,
Right.
if the heart is the issue, or being listed for a heart or lung transplant.
So a bridge to a more permanent solution.
Exactly. If there are not medically suitable candidates for these advanced therapies, or if they haven't had neurological recovery, the difficult decision is often made for terminal decannulation. This involves withdrawing ECMO support and shifting the focus entirely to palliative care to ensure comfort during the dying process. Discussion of organ donation is also strongly advised in cases where brain death occurs while the patient is on ECMO, if it aligns with the patient's or family's wishes.
Right.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, modern ECMO, especially VA ECMO and ECPR, represents perhaps the most direct conceptual descendant of Bryukhonenko's initial, ambitious dream of artificial circulation and oxygenation for life support.
Yeah, you can really see the line.
But it's a monumental leap in scientific understanding, technological sophistication, and crucially, clinical outcomes. We've moved from attempting crude mechanical revival that caused severe brain damage to providing precise, integrated biological and mechanical support that successfully bridges patients to recovery or definitive therapies, all while placing a high priority in preserving brain function.
It's a powerful trajectory from that early, dramatic, and limited machine to today's incredibly complex, team-based system that is saving lives that were previously considered unsalvageable.
Absolutely.
Finally, let's push the boundaries even further into Section 4, pushing boundaries, cryopreservation, and the definition of death. This takes us beyond temporary support and into the speculative realm of attempting to pause biological time itself.
Right, into the really far out territory, some might say.
So what exactly is cryopreservation, often referred to as cryonics, in this human context?
Cryonics is the practice of preserving human bodies, typically after they have been legally declared dead, by cooling them down to very low temperatures, usually using liquid nitrogen.
Okay.
The speculative hope driving this is that future medical technology will be able to reanimate them and successfully treat whatever condition led to their death or the effects of aging. It's a concept that gained some public attention in the 1960s, and historically, it was viewed by many in the mainstream scientific and medical communities with significant skepticism, often described, as the sources note, as a grievous form of quackery.
Grievous quackery, strong words. Given that historical skepticism, what gives modern cryonics practitioners and organizations hope that this might one day work? Is there new science?
Their hope is largely founded on advances in two main areas. First, significant improvements in the preservation technique itself, particularly a process called vitrification.
Vitrification.
Yes. This process involves replacing the water within the body's cells and tissues with special antifreeze-like solutions called cryoprotectants. The aim is to prevent the formation of ice crystals during cooling, because ice crystals cause severe physical damage to cell structures.
Like preventing freezer burn on a massive scale.
Kind of, yeah. The sources acknowledge that the preservation technique has indeed improved considerably and has been shown to prevent this kind of tissue damage compared to older methods of freezing. The second source of hope, which is considerably more speculative and reliant on future technology, is the anticipation of nanotechnology.
Nanobots.
Right. The idea is that future microscopic machines, nanobots, could potentially repair all the cellular damage caused by the original illness, the preservation process itself, and maybe even facilitate the complex process of reanimation.
So the actual freezing or preservation part has gotten better at minimizing damage, but the unfreezing and bringing back to life part is still entirely hypothetical, relies on tech that doesn't exist.
Exactly. The sources make it very clear that while the technique of preservation has advanced significantly, far, far less is understood or known about how a body could ever be successfully reanimated from this state of cryostasis. The entire premise of reanimation hinges heavily on future, currently undeveloped technologies, primarily the predicted capabilities of nanotechnology.
How does the process work, and is there a strict timeline involved? You can't just wait around, presumably.
Timing is absolutely critical, and speed is of the essence after the heart stops. Ideally, the process should begin within 1 or 2 minutes, and definitely preferably within 15 minutes, because autolysis, the natural decomposition of tissues, begins immediately after blood circulation and oxygen supply cease.
Okay, very fast.
Very. However, and this is a crucial legal and ethical point, the process must only begin after a person has been legally declared dead by medical professionals. Starting cryopreservation before legal death could potentially lead to criminal charges like homicide or grievous bodily harm.
Right, needs to be after legal death.
Absolutely. The process itself involves several steps. Rapidly cooling the body, flushing out the blood and replacing it with those cryoprotectant solutions. That's the vitrification step, further cooling the body on ice. And finally, long-term storage in specialized cryogenic dewars filled with liquid nitrogen, where temperatures are extremely low.
So the preservation technique has improved at preventing the freezing damage, but bringing someone back is the giant unknown.
Precisely. The sources emphasize this distinction. The physical preservation technique has become quite sophisticated in preventing structural damage from ice, but the knowledge and technology required for reversing that state and restoring complex biological function simply do not exist yet.
Where is this practiced and what does it cost? Is it accessible?
The leading organizations are primarily based in the USA, such as Alcor Life Extension Foundation and the Cryonics Institute. There's also TransTime in San Francisco and Kriors in Russia. These organizations offer different service levels, and they are not inexpensive.
How much are we talking?
Alcor, for example, charges around $200,000 for whole body preservation and approximately $80,000 for neurocriopreservation, which is the preservation of just the head and brain based on the belief that the essential person is contained within the brain.
Just the head, wow. Alcor's view, as noted in the sources, is quite philosophical. They propose that death is not an instantaneous event, but a process that can potentially be paused. That seems to directly challenge our conventional medical and legal definitions of death.
It absolutely does, and this is precisely where the complex legal issues discussed in Section 4.2 arise. Once a body undergoes cryopreservation, its legal status enters a highly uncertain domain. Legally speaking, the person is no longer considered alive, nor are they considered a legal person with rights and standing.
What does the law say about the status of a cryopreserved body, then? Is it anything?
The sources delve into this, raising the fascinating and legally novel question: does the cryopreserved body effectively become property? The legal term sometimes used in this context is chattel.
Property, like an object.
Well, the general legal rule in many jurisdictions, including English law discussed in the source, is that a human body is not property in the traditional sense. You generally cannot own a dead body like you would own an object. However, legal precedents exist, such as the English cases of Kelly, AV Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust, and Dudeward, which established or explored the work and skill principle.
The work and skill principle, what does that entail?
It suggests that applying lawful work or skill to human remains can, in certain circumstances, give those remains the character of property, but typically where they have been transformed or prepared for a specific use or purpose beyond just awaiting burial or cremation. Examples from these cases included anatomical dissection specimens.
Okay.
The argument presented in the sources is that cryopreservation fits this principle quite strongly. It's an extreme, scientifically sophisticated transformation that involves considerable work and skill. It fundamentally changes the cadaver from its natural state, awaiting decomposition or burial. Therefore, applying this principle, a court could plausibly determine that a cryon, the term sometimes used for a cryopreserved person, becomes property for purposes of possession by the organization that performed the work and is storing it.
So the cryonics company could potentially be seen as legally owning the cryopreserved body in their care. That seems strange.
That is one plausible legal interpretation based on extending the work and skill principle to this entirely novel context, according to the analysis in the sources. However, the sources are careful to present counter-arguments as well.
Like what?
Legal precedents often involve transformations that were effectively irreversible. The preserved remains had a final state or use. Cryonics, by contrast, intends for the transformation to be temporary and eventually undone through reanimation.
The intent matters.
This intent to revert back to a living state could potentially distinguish it legally and argue against it being considered property in the same way.
And this seems to create a fundamental conflict with the traditional rights of next of kin to handle the disposal of a body, like burial or cremation.
Exactly. In most legal systems, the entitlement to dispose of a body is a specific, usually temporary right granted to the executor of the will or the nearest next of kin. If a cryonics organization is argued to have a property right over the cryon, it could potentially challenge or even override this traditional disposal right. This is particularly complex if the person legally entitled to dispose of the body was the one who consented to the cryopreservation in the first place, effectively arguing that disposal occurred when the preservation and storage process began. The sources highlight that this is a legally uncertain area, presenting novel and complex issues that courts haven't definitively ruled on.
So lots of legal gray area.
Definitely. There are also concerns raised within the sources about the potential for exploitation if companies were deemed to own cryons, as it could potentially give them the legal ability to destroy the preserved body without recourse from the family or estate, assuming the contract doesn't explicitly prevent this.
This legal murkiness also seems to open the door to potential future disputes, even assuming reanimation becomes possible someday.
Section 4.3 touches on this, though it's viewed as a less immediate legal problem, but one with significant future potential. Cryonics contracts are generally very specific about what they guarantee. Typically, long-term storage, perhaps for 100 years or more, but they explicitly do not guarantee reanimation.
So the contract is just for storage, with no promise of being brought back, even if the tech exists later.
Correct. This raises a significant potential future conflict. If reanimation science does become possible, is there an implied contractual term, something the court might interpret as being intended by the parties, that the company is obligated to at least attempt reanimation if it becomes feasible and the funds are available?
What's implied versus written?
Exactly. This would require complex court interpretation. The sources express concern that without such an implied term, organizations holding the cryons could potentially hold them for ransom, demanding substantial additional fees from the person's estate for the actual reanimation attempt, even if the science is ready.
Potential for exploitation there.
It highlights potential areas for exploitation inherent in the current contractual framework, which is based on today's technological reality.
It's clear these technologies, from the earliest attempts to the most speculative, push the boundaries of both science and law. But how do they connect back to that fundamental human experience we mentioned earlier, the experience of navigating serious illness and mortality? Section 4.4 brings this dimension into play.
Right. The source discussing the experience of serious illness introduces a really important perspective, that people facing severe health challenges often don't necessarily undergo dramatic transformations or achieve profound spiritual enlightenment, as is sometimes romanticized. Instead, they frequently strive towards normalcy.
Normalcy, like getting back to routine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They want to regain their old routines, their old selves, or, if that's not possible, find a comfortable, predictable new routine that feels normal to them.
And the medical field, with its focus on diagnosis and intervention, can sometimes focus primarily on curing the disease or fixing the broken part, rather than necessarily healing the whole person or helping them adapt to a changed state of being.
Exactly. So we can use that human striving as a lens through which to view these technologies. Does modern ECMO, for example, with its intense intervention, represent a radical tool aimed squarely at restoring an old normal, bringing someone back to how they were before they got so sick? Or is the very state of being on ECMO such an extreme, unnatural condition that it forces a kind of adaptation to a difficult new normal?
Interesting framing. And what about cryopreservation? How does that fit?
Does that represent the ultimate striving for an old normal, the desire to literally bypass the terminal illness or death itself and return to life as it was before the final decline?
It seems these technological pushes against the limits of mortality, from temporary artificial support to potentially pausing biological function indefinitely, deeply intersect with the very human experience of confronting death, finding meaning in the face of physical decline, or adapting to dramatically changing physical and mental states, as discussed in the source on serious illness. They offer powerful tools that can extend life or simulate function, but they also force us to grapple with fundamental questions about what constitutes life, what a good outcome means beyond mere biological existence, what normalcy truly signifies in the face of profound illness, and how we fundamentally relate to our own mortality.
So what does this all mean? Where does this leave us? We've taken a deep dive through a remarkable history, haven't we? Starting with the raw, pioneering attempts at artificial circulation with Bryukhonenko's autojector, driven by the urgent need to save lives in desperate circumstances.
Yeah, a really dramatic start.
We traced that concept through the development of the heart-lung machine, which enabled the revolution of modern cardiac surgery and arrived at today's incredibly sophisticated ECMO technology, which functions as a vital bridge for recovery or further advanced medical intervention. And we've touched upon the speculative frontier of cryopreservation, which challenges the very definition of death itself and raises complex legal and societal questions about the status of a human body preserved with the hope of future reanimation.
We've seen clearly how the underlying principles of supporting circulation and oxygenation outside the body have evolved dramatically. The journey is one from purely mechanical, often crude methods, attempting something akin to brute force revival.
Right, with those limitations.
Towards more biologically integrated, precise, and supportive systems designed to sustain life for longer periods with vastly improved outcomes and a focus on preserving functional integrity, particularly of the brain.
And these advancements don't just exist in a vacuum, do they? They force us to confront some of the most profound questions about our existence. What constitutes life? When does death truly occur? And how does our relentless technological push against the limits of mortality interact with that deeply human desire to live, to find meaning even in suffering, and to strive for some sense of normalcy in the face of illness and the end of life?
Yeah.
The conceptual links between Bryukhonenko's initial goal of artificial support and modern ECMO are striking, as is the way cryopreservation, though entirely speculative for reanimation, fundamentally challenges the established boundaries of life and death that his early experiments also probed.
It really does.
This raises an important question, I think. As technology continues to blur the lines between what we consider alive and dead, and as we develop ever more sophisticated ways to support or even potentially pause biological function, how will society's legal and ethical definitions of life and death continue to evolve in response? Where do we draw the line?
And perhaps even more fundamentally, how will these technologies shape the fundamental human experience of confronting our own mortality and striving for that sense of normalcy? Will they change our understanding of what constitutes a good life or perhaps a good death?
To overcome mortality, to overcome physical limits.
Like that analogy some sources drew to Stephen Hawking, suggesting maybe his mind soared partly because his body was so constrained. It highlights this really complex link between our physical boundaries and our intellectual or spiritual reach. But when does that ambition become reckless? What price is too high to pay in trying to break free from our biology?
And finally, this whole story, the film, the research that followed, the debates that just won't die down, it really underscores how profoundly ethics evolve over time.
Yeah.
What was considered acceptable science in the 1940s or 50s, these kinds of animal experiments or even older stuff like trepanning, we look at it through such a different ethical lens now.
Our understanding of sentience changes, our values about animal welfare or human dignity shift.
Exactly. And that forces us to wrestle with how we judge the past. How do we look back at actions that seem appalling now, especially when they sometimes, somehow, laid the groundwork for good things we have today?
And maybe even more importantly, how do we use that knowledge about changing ethics, about the dangers of unchecked ambition to set the ethical boundaries for science now and for the future? What lines are we drawing? And can we be sure people 80 years from now won't look back at us and be horrified?
So, yeah. When you look back at experiments in the Revival of Organisms, it's clearly not just one simple thing. It's this really complex mix, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a document of real pioneering science, but probably science that was carefully staged and exaggerated for the camera.
Right. It's a piece of history, a piece of political propaganda reflecting Soviet goals. But maybe most powerfully, it's evolved into this enduring cultural myth, a chilling piece of early body horror that taps right into our deepest anxieties about our bodies, about life, about death.
It wasn't just a straightforward documentary, and it wasn't just cynical propaganda. It was most likely this deliberate cinematic showing of genuine, groundbreaking, but also deeply ethically troubling research.
Research that, weirdly, laid foundations for routine modern medicine that saves countless lives, while at the same time it gave birth to these lasting horror movie ideas and keeps fueling debates about science, ethics, and our own complicated, often uneasy relationship with life and death. Debates that are still happening right now in places like online forums.
The film, even 80 years later, it just forces you to confront these uncomfortable truths about the history of science, about the incredible lengths our drive for knowledge and survival can push us, and about that constantly shifting landscape of what we think is okay and what we fear most about our own biology and our own mortality.
So what does it say about us, here in the 21st century, that we're still so fascinated by this unsettling old footage? Why do we keep watching it, arguing about it, getting disturbed by it? And maybe the big question it leaves you with is, what are the ethical boundaries we're unwilling to cross today as scientists, as doctors, as a society? And can we really be confident those lines won't look completely different, maybe even naive or horrifying another 80 years down the road? It really does leave you with a lot to think about.
Thank you for spending your time with us today and for being part of the MD Talk Studios community. Whether you're listening to Runner Stories for the Road, learning with MCAT Pulse, diving into health hacks, exploring MD Talk explainers, or training with our fitness content, we truly appreciate you being here. no matter where you tune in: YouTube, Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share it with someone who would benefit. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful, science-driven stories and educational content for everyone. And as always, this production is for educational purposes only. It is not personal medical advice, does not create a doctor-patient relationship, and should not be used to diagnose or treat any condition. Please speak with your own physician or licensed clinician for guidance that's specific to you. Thank you again for choosing MD Talk Studios. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next episode.